The collapse of German air power did not begin with a single defeat. It began with numbers that refused to cooperate. When war ignited in September 1939, the German Air Force fielded thousands of operational aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and medium bombers designed to support rapid ground offensives. Early campaigns across Poland and France seemed to validate the model. Squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters escorted bombers carrying loads measured in hundreds of pounds each. Stuka dive bombers descended at steep angles, releasing bombs weighing 500 or 1,000 pounds onto bridges, artillery batteries, and troop columns. Coordination between aircraft and armored units fractured opposing armies within weeks. But air wars, like industrial wars, run on production tables. By 1943, the United States alone produced aircraft in quantities exceeding 100,000 per year. Factories across Detroit, California, and Texas rolled airframes down assembly lines, where engines producing over 1,000 horsepower were installed in sequence. The Soviet Union added tens of thousands more aircraft annually, from factories relocated east of the Ural Mountains. Britain sustained its own production lines, turning out Spitfires and bombers in the thousands. Germany increased aircraft output as well, but the gap between production and loss began to widen. Every aircraft lost carried a pilot with it. Training a fighter pilot required months of instruction in gunnery, formation flying, navigation, and landing on narrow runways, often under combat conditions. Early in the war, experienced Luftwaffe pilots accumulated hundreds of flight hours. By 1944, many replacements entered combat with far fewer. Attrition had thinned the cadre of veterans who once trained newcomers. The result was subtle but devastating. Aircraft remained technologically competitive, yet pilot skill levels eroded. Inside the cockpit of a Bf-109, climbing to intercept Allied bombers, the pilot felt the engine vibrate through the control column as the aircraft accelerated past 300 miles per hour. Oxygen masks hissed at altitude. Ahead, formations of American B-17 bombers approached carrying bomb loads measured in several thousand pounds per aircraft. Defensive machine guns protruded from nearly every angle of those bombers, firing rounds weighing ounces, but capable of shredding aluminum skin and fuel lines instantly. The Luftwaffe initially relied on concentrated interception. Fighters attacked bomber formations directly, sometimes firing rockets or cannon shells weighing over half a pound each. Bombers fell from the sky. Yet bomber formations adapted, with tighter defensive boxes and long-range fighter escorts. American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts carried fuel tanks extending their range hundreds of miles into German airspace. German fighters could no longer attack bombers without encountering escorts. I remember reading the combat loss reports from German fighter units during the spring of 1944. The figures begin to accelerate sharply. Aircraft destroyed in combat, pilots killed or wounded, training units forced to send partially prepared replacements directly into operational squadrons. The numbers tell a quiet story. The Luftwaffe was bleeding faster than it could replenish. Fuel worsened everything. German aircraft relied on aviation gasoline, refined partly from synthetic fuel plants derived from coal processing. Allied bombing campaigns targeted those facilities relentlessly. In a single raid, hundreds of bombers could drop thousands of tons of explosives onto refineries and storage tanks. When those plants shut down, aviation fuel output dropped sharply. By 1945, German pilot training sometimes consisted of only a fraction of the flight hours earlier generations had received. Imagine a training airfield in late 1944. A new pilot climbs into a fighter for his first operational sortie. His instructor once accumulated hundreds of hours before combat. He now has perhaps 1/4 of that time. The engine roars to life, but the pilot knows fuel reserves are limited. Every minute in the air consumes precious gallons that cannot be replaced easily. Meanwhile, Allied air forces expanded operations across multiple fronts. Strategic bombers struck industrial centers across Germany, dropping explosives measured in thousands of tons during major raids. Tactical aircraft supported ground offensives in France, Italy, and the Eastern Front. Fighter patrols ranged over rail yards, convoys, and bridges. The Luftwaffe faced not one concentrated opponent, but several air forces operating simultaneously. Aircraft themselves became more resilient and more numerous. A single American bomber group might include dozens of aircraft, each carrying bombs weighing hundreds or thousands of pounds. Escort fighters orbited nearby. When German interceptors attacked, they collided with defensive fire from multiple directions. The Luftwaffe still possessed skilled pilots and formidable aircraft designs. The Focke-Wulf FW190, for example, carried heavy armament capable of shredding bomber formations. Later jet aircraft such as the Me-262 appeared with speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Yet, technological leaps cannot compensate for shortages of trained pilots, fuel, and spare parts. When I examine late-war German maintenance reports, another pattern appears. Aircraft grounded due to lack of parts. Engines required replacement components that factories struggling under bombing could not deliver consistently. Even intact aircraft sometimes remained on runways without sufficient fuel for missions. Air superiority gradually shifted. By the time Allied armies landed in Normandy in June 1944, German aircraft presence above the beaches remained minimal compared with earlier campaigns. Allied fighters dominated the skies, conducting thousands of sorties daily. German attempts to contest airspace collided with superior numbers and increasingly experienced Allied pilots. Picture a German fighter scrambling from a runway as radar reports incoming bomber formations. The pilot climbs rapidly, engines straining. Above him stretches a sky filled with aircraft numbering in the hundreds. Some carry bombs weighing over 1,000 pounds. Others escort with machine guns ready. He fires his cannons, perhaps scoring a hit. Yet when he turns away, more aircraft appear. The air war became a contest of endurance, measured in factories, fuel depots, and training schools. Germany could design advanced aircraft and deploy skilled aces, but the system supporting those pilots fractured under sustained pressure. Production struggled to keep pace with losses. Training hours dropped. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Allied bombers continued arriving, with escorts extending deeper into German airspace. And if you are listening now, perhaps as the room quiets and the day begins to fade, imagine standing beside a fighter aircraft on a cold runway late in the war. The metal skin reflects dim light. Mechanics tighten bolts while fuel trucks ration every gallon. In the distance, you hear engines, hundreds of them, approaching from beyond the horizon. This is the entire history of why the Luftwaffe lost the air war in the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Cardboard Air Force. Germany's Secret Rearmament, 1933 to 1935. Somewhere in the files of the British National Archives at Kew, in a folder classified under reference AIR9, there is a carbon copy of an inspection report that most people have never heard of. The paper is thin, the kind they used for duplicates in the 1930s, slightly foxed at the corner. A British major named Ramsey had written it after touring a series of German civilian aviation depots in 1934. His observations were precise, professional, and deeply puzzled. He noted, in the measured language of a military inspector who does not wish to overstate his case, unusual concentrations of aircraft maintenance personnel at what were officially Lufthansa facilities. And on page 7 of that carbon copy, in handwriting that belongs to an unknown Air Ministry official reviewing the report back in London, someone has circled the phrase ostensibly civilian and written a single word in the margin. The word is lying. That marginalia, that one word, is where this story begins. The Germany of 1933 did not officially have an air force. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden it. The Inter-Allied Military Control Commission had spent more than a decade attempting to enforce that prohibition, with a thoroughness that was, in practice, somewhat optimistic. What the Commission's inspectors kept encountering was a country that had become extraordinarily creative about the legal definition of the word civilian. Lufthansa, Germany's national airline, operated more aircraft than any commercial route structure could justify. Flying clubs throughout Bavaria and the Rhineland trained young men in aerobatics and navigation, far beyond what sport flying required. And in a facility near the Soviet city of Lipetsk, a collaboration between the Weimar-era German military and the Red Army that had been running since 1925, a generation of German pilots had been learning to fly combat aircraft on Russian soil, hidden from any Western inspector. The arrangement ended when Hitler came to power in January 1933, not because it was discovered, but because the politics had changed. Lipetsk closed quietly. The pilots it had trained scattered back into the German aviation system. In 8 years of operation, the base had trained approximately 120 combat pilots. 120 men. That is the number that reveals how small the secret really was. The Reichs Luftfahrtministerium, the German aviation ministry, known by its abbreviation RLM, was established in the spring of 1933, with Hermann Göring as its nominal head and a career aviation administrator named Erhard Milch doing the actual work of building the institution from nothing. The problem Milch faced was simultaneously logistical and legal. Germany needed aircraft, it needed pilots, and it needed factories, and it needed all three without openly admitting that it was building a military force. The solution they adopted was the fiction of dual use. The Junkers Ju-52, a robust corrugated skin transport aircraft, was classified in official paperwork as a civilian airliner. It served Lufthansa routes. It also served as a training platform for bomber crews, because the navigation, instrument flying, and multi-engine procedures required to fly a Ju-52 on a night route from Berlin to Munich were broadly identical to those required to fly a medium bomber on a night mission. The paperwork said one thing, the training logs said another. The Control Commission, when it bothered to look, was reading the paperwork. What Germany was actually stockpiling in this period is, when you cross-reference the import records with the Aviation Ministry's internal procurement files, genuinely striking. By January of 1935, German depots held approximately 1,834 tons of aluminum alloy, enough for roughly 400 airframe-class aircraft, stored at locations the Control Commission had estimated held under 300 tons. The gap between those two numbers is the gap between what the Commission believed Germany was building and what Germany was actually building. But here is the thing that often gets lost in the standard accounts of German rearmament. The secrecy that made this stockpiling possible also distorted the technical quality of what was being produced. When you cannot openly test a military aircraft without risking a diplomatic incident, you test it less. When you cannot openly operate military pilot training programs, you substitute civilian training standards. The result was a force that looked, on paper, far more capable than it actually was, and that had, embedded in its foundational documents, a set of compromises that would prove very difficult to undo once the fiction became official reality. On the 26th of February, 1935, Hermann Göring stood in front of journalists and announced, without particular diplomatic subtlety, that Germany had an air force. The Luftwaffe was officially born. The announcement landed on the British Foreign Office like a minor earthquake. A cable dispatch that same day noted that Göring's figures had exceeded what the intelligence services had estimated by a factor of 3. The British were rattled. They were, however, rattled in the wrong direction. The numbers Göring presented were inflated. This was not accidental. The opening gambit of the Luftwaffe's public existence was a bluff, an overstatement of capability designed to achieve diplomatic leverage. The problem with bluffs in institutional contexts is that they have a tendency to calcify. When an organization publicly claims a capability it doesn't yet possess, the internal pressure to eventually justify that claim can drive engineering and procurement decisions that would otherwise look obviously ill-advised. The Luftwaffe was born announcing itself as larger and more capable than it was. It spent the next decade trying to catch up to its own propaganda. It never quite did. I find it necessary to pause here on a figure who barely appears in the popular history of the Luftwaffe, but who may be the most consequential person in this entire story. Walter Wever was the Luftwaffe's first chief of staff. He was not a flying ace, not a political figure, not a charismatic personality. He was an Army staff officer who had converted to air power theory in the early 1930s and had arrived at a set of strategic conclusions that were, for his time, genuinely sophisticated. Wever understood that a tactical air force, an air force designed primarily to support Army operations on the ground, was a fundamentally limited strategic instrument. He championed the development of long-range four-engine bombers, specifically what he called the Ural bomber, aircraft capable of reaching industrial targets deep inside the Soviet Union. He wrote the Luftwaffe's first doctrinal manual. He argued, persistently and against institutional resistance, that Germany needed the capacity to carry a war to an enemy's economy, rather than simply to support an army's advance. And then, on the 3rd of June, 1936, Walter Wever died. He died not in combat, not in some dramatic operational disaster. He died because he got into his Heinkel HE-70 aircraft at Dresden Airfield and took off without first disengaging the aileron lock. The aircraft rolled inverted immediately after becoming airborne and crashed. The aileron lock is a simple mechanical device. It takes approximately 4 seconds to remove. The man who understood what the Luftwaffe needed to become died because a pre-flight checklist was not completed. When I was going through the chain of doctrinal decisions that followed Wever's death, cross-referencing the subsequent RLM design specifications with what Wever had actually written and argued, I found myself returning again and again to the sheer contingency of it. His death was not a strategic decision. It wasn't even a professional failure. It was the kind of thing that can happen to any pilot on any airfield on any morning. But the institution he left behind had no one of comparable strategic vision to replace him. The officers who moved into his role were tacticians, excellent tacticians in several cases, but men whose professional formation had been in ground support operations, and who instinctively viewed the Luftwaffe as an extension of the army rather than an independent strategic instrument. The heavy bomber program did not die immediately after Wever. It died by administrative attrition over the following 2 years, as budgets and design priorities shifted toward the aircraft that the new leadership actually believed in. The aileron lock didn't just kill a man, it changed a doctrine. The RLM's first formal design specifications, issued in the mid-1930s, already reveal the institutional preferences of the men who had inherited Wever's portfolio. When the specification for a new heavy bomber, what would eventually become the Heinkel He-177, was drawn up, it included a requirement that is almost painful to read in retrospect. The aircraft had to be capable of a 60-degree dive attack, not a shallow dive, a 60-degree dive at terminal velocity. This requirement was inserted at the insistence of Ernst Udet, the Luftwaffe's procurement chief and the most colorful figure in the organization's early history. A World War I ace, an airshow performer, a man who had fallen so completely in love with dive bombing after a visit to the United States that he had purchased 2 American Curtiss Hawk biplanes with his own money to demonstrate the technique. The dive bombing requirement transformed the He-177's design completely. To present the aerodynamic profile of a twin-engine aircraft while delivering 4-engine power, Heinkel's engineers were instructed to couple 2 engines together on a single shared drive shaft. The resulting unit, designated the DB606, required 2 engines to share an oil system, a cooling gallery, and a crankcase, packed into an enclosure designed for one. The thermal mathematics of that configuration, as Heinkel's own stress calculations noted in Appendix C of the initial design documentation, were not favorable. The document appears to have been filed and not acted upon. The specification remained. Germany had, in a single bureaucratic document, determined that its only potential strategic bomber would have engines designed to catch fire. The detail that I keep returning to when I think about the Luftwaffe's founding years isn't the aircraft or the numbers or even the strategic blindness, it's the money. The secret rearmament of the 1930s was expensive, structurally complicated, and distributed across dozens of organizations that didn't openly coordinate with each other. What that produced was not a lean, integrated military force. It produced a collection of capabilities that had each been optimized for concealment, rather than for coherent operational use. The flying clubs trained pilots who were excellent at aerobatics and poor at navigation. The Lufthansa training pipeline produced multi-engine pilots who were smooth and professional and had almost no experience with the kind of aggressive, high-G maneuvering that actual combat requires. The factories were distributed across Germany in a way that made them difficult to inspect, and also made supply chain coordination complicated. When Milch surveyed what he had inherited in the mid-1930s and started trying to rationalize the production system, he found, according to his own records, at least 4 different and partially incompatible aluminum alloy specifications being used at different factories producing nominally identical components. The secrecy that had hidden the rearmament had also prevented the standardization that makes a military-industrial system coherent. Goering announced the Luftwaffe's existence in February of 1935, and the world took notice. The photograph that appeared in the Berliner Morgenpost the following morning showed him in his white uniform, standing in front of aircraft, looking like a man who owned the sky. It was a compelling image. It was also, in nearly every important technical and structural sense, a fiction constructed over a foundation of compromised engineering, inadequate training standards, a suppressed strategic vision, and a procurement system that had substituted theatrical ambition for industrial coherence. Somewhere in the British National Archives, an unnamed civil servant circled the words, ostensibly civilian, and wrote, lying, in the margin. He was right, as far as he went, but the lie wasn't only directed outward, toward Britain and France and the inspection teams of the Control Commission. The deepest lie of the Luftwaffe's founding years was the one Germany told itself, that an air force built on secrecy and bureaucratic fiction could, simply by announcing itself loudly enough, become the thing it was pretending to be. The records, if you read them carefully, suggest that several people inside the system knew this wasn't true. They were not encouraged to say so. The institution rewarded the fiction. It punished the arithmetic. And so the arithmetic waited. Chapter 2. The Spanish Laboratory, Condor Legion, Guernica, and the Wrong Lessons, 1936 to 1939. The 26th of April, 1937, a Monday, a market day, in the Basque town of Guernica in northern Spain. The afternoon light in that part of the world in late April is soft and broad, the kind of light that makes old stone buildings look permanent. Guernica was not a large place, a few thousand people, a town with deep roots in Basque cultural identity, a wooden bridge over the Oka River, a market that drew people in from the surrounding countryside. What happened there that afternoon has been argued about, aestheticized, instrumentalized, and mythologized to such an extraordinary degree over the following 80 years that it has become almost impossible to see the operational documents underneath the Picasso painting. But the operational documents are what I'm interested in. Not because they diminish what happened, they don't, but because what they reveal about the institution that carried it out is more important for this story than anything the casualty figures alone can tell us. In the files of the German Federal Archive at Freiburg, under the reference designation for the Condor Legion, there is a tactical summary dated November of 1937, approximately 6 months after the Guernica attack. It is 47 pages long. It is stamped secret, and it covers, in the methodical and slightly exhausted language of a staff officer doing a professional after-action review, the lessons that Germany's Expeditionary Air Force in Spain believed it had learned from nearly 18 months of combat operations. When you read it, and it requires some patience, because the German of 1930s military documents is not the most accessible prose style, the picture that emerges is of an air force that had learned to be devastatingly effective at a scale too small to matter against a major industrial power. The report recommends the Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber as a precision close support weapon. It describes the integration of observation aircraft and bombing units as a significant tactical advance. It notes that fighter-to-fighter combat had produced experienced and effective pilots. What it does not recommend, what it systematically fails to address, is strategic bombing capability. The words "4-engine" do not appear in the document. The concept of carrying a war to an enemy's industrial base is not discussed. The officers who wrote that report had spent 18 months in Spain, watching the Condor Legion perform close air support operations against an opponent with minimal modern air defense, and they had quite reasonably concluded that this was what air power was for. They were right about Spain. They were catastrophically wrong about Europe. Wolfram von Richthofen, who served as the Condor Legion's chief of staff, and later as one of its commanders, kept an operational diary throughout his time in Spain. Excerpts of that diary have been published and analyzed by several historians, including Klaus Meyer in the 1970s, and what they reveal is a figure of considerable tactical intelligence, a man who genuinely understood how to coordinate aircraft with ground forces, who was impatient with bureaucracy, who pushed his units hard and expected results. His diary entry for the Guernica operation is, in its factual flatness, one of the more striking documents in the Luftwaffe archive. He lists sortie numbers, lists bomb types, 50-kilogram high explosive and incendiary, lists estimated results. There is nothing in the entry that acknowledges civilian casualties in the explicit terms that a modern reader would expect. The clinical detachment isn't unusual for a military operational record of that era, but it tells us something important about the institutional culture von Richthofen was operating within, an institutional culture in which the question of what the aircraft had actually done to the town was secondary to the question of what the aircraft had procedurally accomplished. Results: positive. That was the assessment. It would prove to be the template. The casualty figures from Guernica are worth pausing on, not to minimize the event, but because the gap between the reported and the actual figures is itself a significant part of the story. The Basque government's initial claims, made in the immediate aftermath, cited more than 1,600 dead. That number spread across the international press and lodged itself in the world's consciousness. It was the number that Picasso was responding to when he painted his canvas later that year. A detailed retrospective study using civil registry records, published by the Basque government itself in 1987, revised that figure substantially downward, to somewhere between 150 and 170 dead. More recent scholarship, including Gordon Thomas's work, suggests figures closer to 400. The range is wide. But what matters for this particular argument is not which figure is closest to the truth. It's that the original, inflated figure was never corrected by the German side. The Luftwaffe did not deny responsibility for Guernica in the initial phase through honest counter numbers. It denied responsibility entirely, and the inflated casualty figures, left unchallenged, created an impression of Luftwaffe precision and destructive capability that was far larger than the operational reality. Germany had inadvertently mythologized its own air force. The myth of the Luftwaffe as an invincible, city-destroying machine. A myth that would contribute significantly to the psychological collapse of European populations in 1939 and early 1940, was built partly on inflated numbers that Germany never bothered to correct because the psychological effect served its political purposes. The bluff had found its natural environment. In the period between July of 1936 and March of 1939, the Condor Legion cycled approximately 5,000 German personnel through Spain: air crews, technical specialists, ground crews, signals officers. The total bomb tonnage they dropped across the entire duration of the Spanish Civil War was approximately 17,000 tons. 17,000 tons sounds like a significant number until you place it next to the fact that RAF Bomber Command would regularly deliver that same tonnage against a single German city in a single night's operations by 1943. Spain was, in terms of the destructive arithmetic of the war that was coming, a laboratory experiment conducted with toy equipment. The pilots who cycled through it came back as the Luftwaffe's most experienced combat aviators and became, almost immediately, its instructors and wing commanders. They were brilliant, they were genuinely dangerous, and they had learned their trade in an environment so fundamentally different from what they would face in 1940 that the lessons they carried with them were, in certain crucial respects, more misleading than no lessons at all would have been. I've spent a considerable amount of time with the Condor Legion's operational records, trying to understand whether anyone inside the German aviation system was drawing the right strategic conclusions from Spain, whether there was a voice in those documents saying, essentially, this works against opponents without modern air defenses, but we need to think carefully about what happens when we face someone with a functioning radar network and experienced interceptor pilots. There are hints. There are individual officers who, in their private correspondence, express concerns about whether the Stuka's vulnerability to fast monoplane fighters has been adequately addressed. When Soviet-supplied Polikarpov 115 and 116 fighters began appearing over Spanish skies in late 1936, Stuka loss rates increased sharply, and von Richthofen's own diary notes the problem. But the institutional response to that data point is revealing. The answer was not to reconsider the Stuka's role, or to acknowledge that its operational effectiveness was contingent on air superiority. The answer was to develop better fighter escort doctrine, which is a rational tactical response, and which entirely misses the strategic point that in any future major war, fighter escort of the reliability that Spain had demonstrated could not be guaranteed. The right lesson was treated as an engineering problem to be solved with better coordination. The deeper question, whether the Stuka should be the centerpiece of the whole close support doctrine, was not seriously asked. When I cross-reference the 1938 Spanish Lessons conference minutes with the production specifications being issued by the RLM in the same period, I find it striking, genuinely striking, not in a rhetorical sense, that the decisions being made in Berlin in 1938 were so perfectly calibrated to fight the Spanish Civil War. More Stukas, refined close support procedures, investment in tactical communication between ground observation aircraft and dive bombers. All of this would prove, in the Polish campaign of 1939 and the French campaign of 1940, remarkably effective. The tactical doctrine that emerged from Spain was, within its own operational frame, close to brilliant. It's what wasn't being built in 1938 and 1939 that matters. The long-range bombers, the training infrastructure for multi-theater sustained operations, the strategic planning frameworks for fighting a war against a fully industrialized opponent. General Albert Kesselring's conference notes from that period record the formal deprioritization of strategic bombing capability as a conclusion of the Spanish experience. It is a decision that was made by intelligent professionals on the basis of available evidence. The evidence was simply, structurally, too small. The Condor Legion's most important contribution to the war that followed wasn't tactical doctrine or bomb tonnage. It was a cohort of men. The pilots who flew in Spain, who had actually fired their guns at another aircraft, who had navigated in bad weather over unfamiliar terrain, who understood the difference between training and combat at the level of the body rather than the intellect, came home as the hardened nucleus around which the wartime Luftwaffe would organize itself. By 1939 and 1940, they were the experienced core of every major flying unit. They were extraordinary airmen. What they were not, and this is the thing that the casualty records of 1942 and 1943 make absolutely clear, was replaceable. Spain had built a thin layer of exceptional capability over a training system that had no depth. When the exceptional layer was gone, the system had nothing behind it. The Condor Legion veterans were an asset with no redundancy. The moment they began dying faster than the training pipeline could produce equivalents, the entire structure became fragile in a way that no amount of aircraft production could address. The 1937 tactical summary from the Condor Legion files, the one stamped "Results, Positive," was circulated among senior Luftwaffe planners and incorporated into doctrine. Its recommendations about close air support, dive bombing, and fighter escort coordination became foundational. And in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, the results did indeed look positive. The German army moved faster than any army in Europe had moved in a generation, and the Luftwaffe's Stukas screamed down onto columns and bridges and command posts in ways that confirmed every assumption the Spanish experience had generated. The reports that came back from the Polish campaign and the French campaign said, "This works." The reports were not wrong, but they were incomplete. The campaigns of 1939 and 1940 worked in large part because the opponents were either structurally overwhelmed or tactically surprised. The question the Condor Legion's experience had left unanswered: what happens when you face an opponent who is neither overwhelmed nor surprised, who has radar and modern interceptors, and an integrated air defense system and a functioning industrial economy behind them? That question was still waiting, patient and enormous, at the edge of the English Channel. There is a detail from the Condor Legion period that sits in the back of my mind every time I read through the operational records from Spain. In the summer of 1936, before the major combat operations began, the Condor Legion performed what was probably the world's first large-scale military airlift, transporting approximately 13,500 of Franco's soldiers across the Strait of Gibraltar in Ju-52 transports over roughly 10 weeks. It was a genuine operational achievement, and it was accomplished against essentially no air opposition. Von Richthofen's diary records it with satisfaction. What no one in the diary pauses to note is the contingent condition that made it possible. No modern fighters were trying to intercept the transports. The airlift proved that Ju-52s could move men efficiently, reliably, and quickly in a permissive environment. The conclusion drawn from that demonstration, that the Luftwaffe could supply encircled forces by air when required, would be applied again in a very different environment 6 years later. The transport aircraft would be the same. The Ju-52s would be the same. The cold would be different. The Soviet fighters would be different. And the pocket being supplied would be Stalingrad. Chapter 3. The Man Who Built It. Erhard Milch, the bureaucrat who flew. There is a photograph of Erhard Milch that I keep returning to while working on this history. It was taken sometime in the late 1930s, and it shows a compact, precise-looking man in a Luftwaffe uniform, sitting at a desk covered in papers, looking directly at the camera with an expression that manages to be simultaneously alert and exhausted. He looks like a man who has just found an error in a ledger and is deciding how to explain it to someone who does not want to hear about it. That expression, I think, is the most accurate portrait of Milch's position inside the Luftwaffe that exists. He was the most technically capable administrator in the organization. He had a clearer understanding of what the Luftwaffe could and could not produce than anyone above him in its hierarchy, and he spent the better part of a decade being correct about things that his superiors did not wish to hear, and living with the consequences. Milch had come to the aviation ministry in 1933 from Lufthansa, where he had served as director general and turned a struggling national airline into something that actually functioned. His skills were organizational and quantitative. He understood supply chains. He understood production scheduling. He understood the relationship between manufacturing capacity and operational capability in a way that career military officers almost never did. Goering needed him, and, in the particular way of powerful men who need the competence of subordinates they simultaneously resent, never quite forgave him for being needed. The other complicating factor in Milch's position was one that could never be openly discussed within the Nazi state. There was credible evidence that his biological father was Jewish. Goering had arranged for official documentation establishing Milch's legitimate Aryan descent. The protection was real, and it was complete, as far as the formal record went. But it also created a permanent asymmetry of power between the two men that both understood and neither acknowledged. Goering owned a piece of Milch's survival. Milch understood that the protection could be withdrawn. The result was a professional relationship in which the most capable technical mind in the Luftwaffe was permanently operating under conditions that made direct, persistent challenge of Goering's decisions not merely professionally dangerous, but existentially risky. In the summer of 1937, Milch produced a memorandum for Goering that is one of the most important documents in the Luftwaffe's administrative history, and one of the least cited in popular accounts of the air war. The memo addressed the relationship between the Luftwaffe's expansion program and the industrial capacity required to support it. The expansion plan, as specified by the Reich Aviation Ministry at that point, required Germany to be producing 1,000 aircraft per month by 1940. Milch's analysis of existing factory infrastructure, raw material allocation chains, and skilled labor availability produced a different number. The maximum achievable figure, he wrote, was approximately 600 aircraft per month. The memo was filed. Goering did not respond to it. What happened over the following 3 years, the progressive gap between announced production targets and actual delivery figures, the chronic shortage of trained mechanics, the supply chain bottlenecks that would eventually leave Ju-88 production lines running at 34% of theoretical capacity. All of it was, in a sense, the predictable unfolding of a scenario that Milch had described in writing in 1937. The document existed. It had been received. It had not been acted on. The production system that Milch was attempting to manage had a specific and thoroughly documented problem that went beyond any individual factory's performance. The Ju-88, Germany's primary medium bomber and one of the most versatile aircraft the Luftwaffe operated, had been designed in 1936 with approximately 4,800 individual components. Under pressure to accelerate production timelines in the late 1930s, successive design changes had been introduced without completing full part standardization reviews. By 1941, there were at minimum 4 incompatible versions of the aircraft, sharing a single production line, meaning that a replacement part ordered for one variant would not fit another. A crankshaft bearing from one batch was not interchangeable with the equivalent bearing from a different batch. A hydraulic fitting that fit one series of airframes would not seal correctly on the next. Milch's first significant act upon being given expanded procurement authority in late 1941 was to freeze design changes, to stop accepting modifications and improvements from engineering departments, and simply let the production line run with what it had. It infuriated frontline commanders who wanted improvements. It was the only way to restore any coherence to the supply chain. The fact that this decision had to be made at all, in the middle of a war, reveals how thoroughly the crash rearmament of the 1930s had sacrificed industrial coherence for the appearance of speed. Ernst Udet occupies a strange position in the Luftwaffe's institutional history. Strange because he is simultaneously one of the most documented figures in the organization and one of the most misunderstood. He was a World War I ace with 62 confirmed victories, a genuine aviation celebrity, a man whose skill in an aircraft was by all accounts genuinely extraordinary. What he was not was an engineer, or a production manager, or a systems thinker of any kind. His appointment as the Luftwaffe's chief of technical development and procurement, the position that made him responsible for specifying, testing, and procuring essentially every aircraft Germany would fly in the war, was driven by his fame and his relationship with Goering, not by any relevant professional qualification. The decisions that flowed from his office in the late 1930s, including the dive bombing specification for the HE-177 and a consistent preference for medium bombers over long-range strategic aircraft, reflected his personal enthusiasms more than any coherent analysis of what Germany's Air Force actually needed. Milch and Udet had a working relationship of sustained mutual frustration that the archive records in considerable detail. Milch's diaries document specific instances of recommendations made and ignored, production warnings filed and buried, engineering analyses produced and not forwarded. The system between them was dysfunctional in a very precise way. The person with the technical knowledge did not have the authority, and the person with the authority did not have the technical knowledge. When I was working through the post-war interrogation transcripts at the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, specifically Milch's interrogations, which run to many pages and are among the most substantive technical documents produced in the immediate aftermath of the European War, I found myself reading one particular exchange multiple times. An American interviewer asks Milch why Germany didn't begin mass production of jet aircraft in 1942. Milch's response is very long. It covers production capacity, fuel requirements, pilot training infrastructure, raw material constraints. And then, at the end of his answer, an American intelligence officer has written in the margin, in pencil, "He's still angry." The notation is not analytical, it's observational. But it captures something that the formal testimony alone doesn't quite convey. That Milch was not, in 1945, describing historical events with the detachment of a man reviewing someone else's decisions. He was describing decisions that he had argued against, correctly, at the time, and that had been overridden by an authority structure that valued loyalty and optimism over accuracy and professional judgment. He was still angry because the anger was, from an evidential standpoint, entirely justified. The moment that crystallizes Milch's position most clearly comes not from the interrogation transcripts, but from a specific entry in his diary from 1944, which has been partially reproduced in the secondary literature. Goering, under sustained pressure from Hitler over the Luftwaffe's failures, over the bombing of German cities, over the inability to protect the Reich, over the absence of a functioning jet program, turns on Milch in front of junior officers at a production conference. "You have deceived me," Goering tells him. Milch's diary records his response to this accusation. "I have never in my life deceived him. He has only heard what he wished to hear." That sentence, its precision, its controlled fury, its absolute absence of self-pity, is one of the most important statements in the Luftwaffe's institutional history. It describes, in 11 words, the mechanism by which Germany's most capable Air Force administrator was systematically neutralized. He told the truth. The truth was unwelcome. The unwelcome truth was filtered out by an authority structure that had organized itself around the preferences of a man who could not afford to know how bad things actually were. By the time Milch was given genuine authority over aircraft production in November of 1941, following the suicide of Ernst Udet, whose office he inherited in a state of organizational chaos, he achieved something genuinely remarkable. Working from a production base that had been mismanaged for years, he drove monthly aircraft output from approximately 981 units in October of 1941 to over 1,500 by the middle of 1942. It's one of the cleaner demonstrations of what competent management can accomplish inside a flawed system, and it makes the preceding years of mismanagement all the more instructive by contrast. The production system could have been rationalized earlier. The design freeze could have been imposed earlier. The supply chain coherence that Milch spent his first 6 months of authority creating could have existed from the beginning, had the people making decisions been the people who understood the numbers. The gap between what the Luftwaffe's production system actually delivered and what it could theoretically have delivered is the space where the war was lost before it started. There is an organizational principle that the Luftwaffe's history illustrates with painful clarity. In a system where accurate reporting is professionally dangerous, accurate information stops flowing upward, and then stops being generated at all. Milch could write his 1937 memorandum, warning that the production targets were unachievable. He could file it, correctly marked, through the proper channels. And because the answer he received was silence, not refutation, not engagement, but simply silence, he could do little more than continue watching the gap between the official targets and the actual figures widen every month. His position depended on a protection that Göring could withdraw at any moment. The personal vulnerability and the professional vulnerability reinforced each other in a feedback loop that the institutional structure had no mechanism for interrupting. The result was an organization in which the most informed person could not enforce his knowledge. Germany had the data. It simply had a system that had arranged itself to prevent the data from mattering. Milch survived the war. He was tried at Nuremberg and convicted on charges related to his use of forced labor in the armaments industry, a conviction that the post-war tribunal was right to impose, and that complicates any straightforward reading of his role. He served a prison sentence, was released, and lived until 1972. The post-war interrogation transcripts preserve his voice, precise, analytical, still visibly frustrated, as a record of what a functioning technical mind looks like inside a fundamentally dysfunctional system. He was not a hero of this story. He was a capable man who served a criminal state and built weapons for it with considerable efficiency. But he is also, in a specific and well-documented sense, the person who best understood what the Luftwaffe was failing to do, years before those failures became visible in the air above England and Russia and the Atlantic. The production warnings in his desk drawer are still there in the archive. They always were. Nobody wanted to read them. Chapter 4, 42 Seconds over Warsaw. The Polish Campaign and the Illusion of Mastery, September 1939. The 1st of September, 1939. In the Luftwaffe's operational war diary, now held at the German Federal Archive in Freiburg, the morning's activities begin in the column format that military diarists use. Aircraft type, target designation, departure time, estimated time over target, result. Most of the entries record airfield attacks, railway junctions, communication centers. Standard opening campaign targets, professionally listed, efficiently executed. But there is one entry, filed before the guns of the Westerplatte fortification had even opened fire on the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein a few kilometers away, that is different from the others. The target is listed as Wielun, a small market town in central Poland, with no significant military installation, no airfield, no rail yard of strategic importance. The result column says, Ziel vernichtet, target destroyed. The time listed in the result column is 4:42 in the morning. The Westerplatte action, traditionally described as the opening shot of the Second World War, does not occur until approximately 4:48. The air war begins 6 minutes before the official start of the conflict, and it begins over a market town. The Polish Air Force that the Luftwaffe was tasked with destroying in September of 1939 was not, on paper, negligible. Polish air crews were well trained and experienced, and the PZLP-11 fighter, while outclassed by the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in speed and ceiling, was maneuverable and robust. The standard German account of the Polish campaign, echoed in the OKW communiques issued in the opening days, claimed that the Luftwaffe had destroyed the vast majority of Poland's air force on the ground in the first 48 hours. The classic opening gambit of air supremacy doctrine, catching aircraft before they could take off. This claim was accepted, reported by international press, and incorporated into the mythology of Luftwaffe invincibility that would precede it into every subsequent campaign. There is one significant problem with it. It wasn't true. Polish Air Force Commander Józef Zielinski, in his detailed operational study published decades after the war, and the Polish Air Force Historical Commission's report of 1946, both document what actually happened on the morning of the 1st of September. Polish commanders had received enough warning in the preceding days to disperse their aircraft to field strips during the evening of the 31st of August. The airfields the Luftwaffe struck with such devastating precision on the 1st of September were, in significant proportion, empty. The aircraft were already gone. The official German casualty claim, 90% of the Polish Air Force destroyed on the ground, against the actual figure of approximately 30%, is a gap worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something structural rather than merely factual. The Luftwaffe's opening day intelligence failure was complete. They didn't know the Poles had dispersed, which means either their pre-campaign reconnaissance was inadequate or their analysis of what the reconnaissance showed was wrong. But the failure compounds at the reporting level. The pilots who flew the first-day airfield strikes reported aircraft destroyed, wreckage photographed, hangars burning, real evidence of real damage. The damage was real. The aircraft they destroyed were largely the ones Poland had already decided to sacrifice. The live aircraft were at dispersal strips, and the PZLP-11 squadrons that had moved there on the 31st of August flew continuously until the 17th of September, shooting down approximately 126 Luftwaffe aircraft during those 16 days. The German intelligence failure and the reporting failure compounded each other perfectly. The claim of 90% destruction was filed, circulated, and accepted. The 126 losses were filed as operational casualties, without any formal institutional examination of the uncomfortable arithmetic they represented. What the Polish campaign actually demonstrated, away from the spectacular claims and the propaganda imagery, was the devastating effectiveness of closely coordinated air and ground operations against an opponent who was outgunned, outnumbered, and operating on a strategic defensive. The radio coordination between Henschel HS-126 observation aircraft and Junkers Ju-87 Stuka units represented something genuinely new in the history of warfare. Aircraft directed in real time to targets that ground troops couldn't see, using radio protocols that had been refined in Spain and were now being applied at operational scale. The system required the observation aircraft's crew to relay grid coordinates to the Stuka's radio operator, who translated them to a visual ground marker and communicated dive parameters to his pilot, all within a 90-second coordination window. In Poland, against anti-aircraft defenses that were sparse and poorly coordinated, that 90-second window was achievable consistently. It worked. It worked so well that the question of whether it would work under different conditions, against an opponent with concentrated anti-aircraft fire, against an opponent whose fighters could reach the Stuka during that 90-second low and slow window, was not seriously pressed in the post-campaign analysis. The fuel numbers for the Polish campaign are figures that Milch had in his desk, and that the operational commanders largely did not discuss openly. The entire Luftwaffe effort over Poland consumed approximately 1,176 tons of aviation fuel per operational day at peak intensity. Germany's total aviation fuel stockpile in September of 1939 was sufficient for approximately 7 weeks of that consumption rate. 7 weeks of maximum operations. That was the entire strategic depth behind the opening campaign of what would eventually become a 6-year war. The campaign itself lasted less than 4 weeks, so the immediate arithmetic resolved in Germany's favor. But the implicit assumption baked into German strategic planning, that future campaigns would also last roughly 4 weeks, that the Luftwaffe would never need to sustain maximum operational tempo for longer than its stocks could support, was not a calculated assessment. It was a hope, dressed in the borrowed clothing of Polish campaign success. I've gone back through von Richthofen's post-campaign diary entries and the senior staff conference notes from the end of September 1939 several times, looking for evidence that anyone in the Luftwaffe's upper leadership was asking the question that the fuel numbers demanded. The closest I can find is Milch, who, according to the records of the post-campaign assessment meeting in Berlin, raised the issue of pilot replacement rates, noting that losses during the campaign had been higher than pre-campaign projections suggested, and asking what the training pipeline looked like for a sustained engagement. According to the conference notes, the question was received without a substantive response. It was not, apparently, the mood of the moment. The mood of the moment was September of 1939. Germany had just conquered Poland in 18 days, and the dominant institutional emotion was closer to exhilaration than analytical caution. Milch understood this. He filed his concerns through the proper channels, watched them receive the silence that had become familiar to him, and went back to his production tables. There is a small detail from the Polish campaign that seems trivial, but that I find clarifies something important about the Luftwaffe's institutional character at this moment. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka had been fitted, in its production versions, with a fixed siren mounted on its undercarriage legs, a device that, when the aircraft dived, produced a rising, wailing sound that witnesses consistently described as terrifying. The siren was not a weapon. It didn't do anything to the target. It had been added purely for its psychological effect on civilian populations and poorly trained troop formations. And in Poland, against a civilian population that had never heard anything like it, and against troops who had no frame of reference for mass dive bombing, it worked spectacularly. Witnesses described road columns scattering, horses bolting, soldiers abandoning positions at the sound alone. The siren's effectiveness was factored into the Luftwaffe's understanding of the Stuka as a weapon system. What was not factored in was the following. The siren worked on people who had never heard it before. An RAF Hurricane pilot in the summer of 1940 would hear the siren, recognize it as a Stuka in a dive, and understand that the aircraft was now traveling at roughly 383 kilometers per hour on a predictable parabolic trajectory with its attention committed to the target below. The siren that terrified Warsaw was, over the English Channel, a targeting aid for the very pilots it was supposed to frighten. The bombing of Warsaw on the 25th of September, 1939, is documented in the operational records with the same column format efficiency as every other target in the campaign. Approximately 560 tons of bombs and 72 tons of incendiaries. Werner Baumbach, a Heinkel 111 pilot who flew in the campaign and later wrote one of the more honest German aviation memoirs, was present for these operations. His account doesn't romanticize what happened. He describes the scale of the fires visible from altitude and the specific professional satisfaction, and then something more complex, of looking at the results on the way home. The deliberate targeting of civilian residential areas and the city's water supply infrastructure was not an accident of imprecision. It was a policy. The documentation of that decision, who gave the specific order, what targeting criteria were applied, which officers signed which authorization, was examined at Nuremberg. Baumbach's memoir occupies an interesting position in that record, a professional pilot describing professional operations with an increasing acknowledgement, carefully managed, that the professionalism was in service of something he was not entirely certain how to name. The post-campaign assessment meeting in Berlin at the end of September assembled the senior leadership of the Luftwaffe to review what had been accomplished and what it meant. The notes from that meeting, partially reproduced in Matthew Cooper's History of the German Air Force, record almost universal satisfaction. Poland had been conquered in 18 days. The Stuka had performed beyond expectations. The radio coordination protocols had worked. The close support doctrine from Spain had scaled to operational level without fundamental failure. The one dissenting note came, as it reliably did, from Milch. Pilot replacement rates were higher than projected, and the training pipeline needed examination. The note was recorded. It was not acted on. The meeting concluded in a mood of institutional confidence that the records describe without apparent irony. Nobody at that meeting seems to have looked at the fuel number, the 7 weeks of stocks that the campaign had shown could be consumed in 4, and asked what that ratio implied for the kind of war that might follow Poland. The question was available. The arithmetic was in the files. The mood of the room was not interested in it. The last formal act of the Luftwaffe in the Polish campaign was the landing of occupation forces and the administrative processing of captured equipment. Among the items inventoried at Polish airfields were dozens of aircraft that the dispersal order of the 31st of August had placed at field strips too small and too scattered for the Luftwaffe's first-day strikes to have found. These aircraft, PZLP-11s, PZLP-20s-3s, a scattering of newer types, were now German property, photographed, catalogued, and distributed to training units for technical analysis. The intelligence value was real. What nobody seems to have recorded in any of the documents from that period is the implication of their existence, that if Poland had had more time, better aircraft, and more strategic depth, the dispersal order of August 31st would have made the Luftwaffe's opening campaign substantially more costly than it had been. The aircraft that had escaped were proof that the tactic worked. That observation appears nowhere in the post-campaign literature. The 90% destroyed claim was the one that survived, traveled forward into the following year, and shaped the operational assumptions that would accompany the Luftwaffe across the French border in May of 1940. The assumption that air forces could be destroyed on the ground was true, provided they cooperated by staying on the ground. The Poles hadn't cooperated. Nobody noticed. Chapter 5. The Spreadsheet that Condemned France. Logistics, Fuel, and the Hidden Fragility of May 1940. The 20th of May, 1940. 10 days into the campaign in the West, General Major Hans-Georg von Seidel, the Luftwaffe's quartermaster general, sits somewhere in the administrative machinery of the Air Force, with a fuel consumption table in front of him. The table is dense with figures, daily consumption rates, forward depot inventories, projected delivery schedules from Reich supply points to the forward airfields that had been established as the campaign pushed through Belgium and into France. Von Seidel was a logistics officer. His job was to keep the numbers honest, and the numbers he was looking at on the 20th of May were honest in a way that the operational briefings being prepared for Göring that same day were not. At the bottom of his supply report for that date, in his own handwriting, he wrote a sentence in German that translates to approximately, "Fuel stocks for 18 further days of combat." On the 20th of May, 1940, the German army had not yet reached the Channel coast. The fuel for the conquest of Western Europe was almost gone. The Luftwaffe that crossed the Belgian border on the 10th of May, 1940, was, in the strict operational sense of the term, a formidable instrument. It operated over 1,800 aircraft in the initial assault, launched approximately 1,815 sorties on the first day alone, and achieved a degree of coordination with the advancing panzer columns that, for anyone watching from the outside, appeared to be something close to perfect. The first-day fuel consumption figure, approximately 4,100 tons of aviation fuel, was the largest single-day draw the Luftwaffe had ever made on its reserves. Von Seidel's daily log began its countdown from that figure. What makes his fuel reports uniquely valuable as primary sources comes to the operational diaries and headquarters summaries that dominate the standard accounts of the French campaign, is that they were written for internal logistical use. They were not written to impress Hitler. They were not written to manage Göring's expectations. They were written to tell the supply system what it needed to know to function. And what they record, day by day through May and into June of 1940, is an Air Force operating at the absolute outer edge of its logistical capacity, a machine consuming its own future at a rate that made everything it was achieving strategically unsustainable. The Battle of France, as a piece of operational history, has been covered in enormous detail. The breakthrough at Sedan, the drive to the coast, the cutting off of Allied forces in Belgium, the collapse of French strategic cohesion, the evacuation from Dunkirk. What interests me here is a narrower question. What did the Luftwaffe's logistical reality look like at the precise moment that Göring was making operational promises to Hitler? On the 14th of May, the day of Rotterdam, 4 days into the campaign, the fuel consumption pace established in the first 4 days was continuing at a rate von Seidel's reports flagged as above the projected sustainable level. By the 24th of May, the date of the famous halt order that stopped the panzer advance short of Dunkirk, his reports show that serviceability rates for medium bombers had fallen to approximately 52%. Roughly half the available aircraft were in maintenance on any given day, a figure that results from the combination of combat damage, the inevitable mechanical attrition of high-tempo operations, and the simple inability of forward maintenance crews to keep up with demand at the pace being imposed. Göring's promise to Hitler that the Luftwaffe could destroy the trapped Allied armies at Dunkirk without requiring the panzers to complete the encirclement was made on the 24th of May, 1940. He made that promise when half his medium bomber force was in maintenance sheds. The Rotterdam bombing on the 14th of May is one of those events whose operational mechanics are consistently oversimplified in popular accounts. The bombing of Rotterdam city center, which killed approximately 814 civilians and destroyed the medieval heart of a major European city, occurred despite the fact that Dutch surrender negotiations were already underway and that a radio abort order had been transmitted to the bomber formations. The abort signal reached one of the two formations. It did not reach the other. Heinkel 111s of the unit designated Kampfgeschwader 54 carried out the attack, their crews following orders that had already been superseded by events they had no way of knowing about. The Luftwaffe's own post-battle communications review found that the protocol for transmitting abort orders required the signal to pass through 2 relay stations, a design that introduced sufficient delay and signal redundancy risk that a time-critical abort could not be guaranteed to arrive before an already committed formation reached its bomb release point. The report recommended a redesigned system. The redesigned system was not implemented. The institutional capacity to correct documented procedural failures was, at this point in the Luftwaffe's history, simply not functioning. The halt order of the 24th of May, the decision that allowed the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force to escape from Dunkirk, has been argued about by historians for more than 80 years. The traditional account, developed most influentially by Basil Liddell Hart in his post-war interviews with German commanders, attributes it primarily to Göring's intervention, the Reichsmarschall wanting to reserve the destruction of the British force as a Luftwaffe achievement rather than an army one. Subsequent scholarship, particularly Karl-Heinz Frieser's meticulous reconstruction of the campaign's decision-making, has complicated this picture considerably. Frieser found evidence for multiple simultaneous motivations. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's genuine concern about overextended panzer supply lines, Hitler's residual hope of a negotiated settlement with Britain that might be complicated by the destruction of its army, and Göring's lobbying for Luftwaffe primacy. The decision was probably overdetermined in the way that major historical junctures often are. Several different people arrived at the same conclusion for several different reasons, and the convergence gave it a force that any single motivation alone might not have produced. What is not in dispute is that Göring's guarantee, his specific assurance that the Luftwaffe could finish the job, was the military justification that allowed the other motivations to find their expression. The guarantee was made against a supply reality that made it impossible. Von Seidel's figures were in the building. No one with authority over the decision appears to have read them. When I was cross-referencing von Seidel's fuel reports against the operational summaries being prepared for Göring in the same period, the gap between the two documents was, to put it plainly, alarming. The operational summaries, written for a senior audience that valued momentum and achievement, described an air force at the peak of its capabilities, delivering results. Von Seidel's reports, written for internal logistics use, and therefore not subject to the institutional filters that shape the upward reporting system, described an air force consuming itself. On the 6th of June, 1940, 2 weeks before the French armistice, von Seidel's figures show that the total aviation fuel consumed during the campaign to that point had already exceeded Germany's entire monthly production capacity. The campaign had not yet ended. France had not yet surrendered. The Luftwaffe was, in logistical terms, operating on borrowed reserves. The 6 weeks between the fall of France on the 22nd of June and the start of the Battle of Britain in early August, the 6 weeks that Göring had to rebuild his operational capacity, began with an aviation fuel reserve of approximately 9,600 tons. The minimum reserve considered operationally necessary to sustain the coming campaign over England was approximately 80,000 tons. The gap between 9,600 and 80,000 is not a planning oversight. It is 8.5 times the available resource. The Battle of France produced for the Luftwaffe 1,236 aircraft destroyed and approximately 738 pilots killed or missing. The pilot loss figure is the one that deserves more attention than it typically receives, because the production line could replace aircraft faster than the training pipeline could replace experienced pilots. The men lost over France, the veterans of Spain, the pre-war training cohort, the men who had built the Condor Legion's tactical doctrine, were dying at a rate that the training system could not fully absorb, particularly given that the training system was itself being strained by the same operational tempo that was consuming the combat units. When Milch raised the training pipeline question after Poland, the answer had been silence. After France, the question was more urgent. The operational pressure was more intense. The silence was the same. It's worth spending a moment with the Bf-109E, the fighter that carried the main burden of Luftwaffe air superiority operations in the Western campaign. The aircraft carried 400 liters of fuel in its main tank. At combat power settings, this gave it an operational range of approximately 660 kilometers. From the forward bases established in the Pas de Calais after the French armistice, 660 kilometers was just barely enough to reach London, conduct a brief engagement, and return. The word briefly requires a specific definition. The Bf-109's technical manual, the Flugzeughandbuch for the E model, calculated the available combat time over the London area from Pas de Calais bases at approximately 25 minutes. Every Luftwaffe planning officer had access to this document. The number was not a secret. The decision to conduct sustained air superiority operations over England with a single-engine fighter whose combat endurance over the target was less than half an hour was made in full knowledge of the arithmetic. The arithmetic was then not communicated, with appropriate weight, to the pilots who would have to live inside it. The total aviation fuel consumed by the Luftwaffe in its 6-week Western campaign was, by von Seidel's final audit, approximately 177,000 tons. Germany's total monthly aviation fuel production in June of 1940 was approximately 170,000 tons. The campaign consumed, in 6 weeks, slightly more than 1 full month of the Reich's entire aviation fuel output. When the armistice was signed at Compiègne on the 22nd of June, in the same railway carriage that France had used for the German armistice in 1918, because Hitler wanted the symmetry, the Luftwaffe had approximately 9,600 tons of operational fuel reserve. Göring had 6 weeks to rebuild before the Battle of Britain would need to begin. He used a significant portion of them attending victory celebrations. The rest were consumed by the organizational overhead of repositioning units from French bases, processing captured equipment, and managing the administrative aftermath of a continental campaign. Von Seidel's supply tables kept filling in their columns. The columns kept showing the same uncomfortable truth. Nobody who needed to act on them did. The French campaign ends, in the operational records, with a clipped efficiency that the documents transfer to the historical account. Objectives achieved, enemy forces defeated, armistice signed. The column formats close with the standard administrative notations. What doesn't appear in the columns is the particular kind of strategic exhaustion that von Seidel's fuel reports describe. The exhaustion of an institution that has achieved its immediate objective by consuming reserves that it cannot rebuild in time for the next one. The Bf 109 pilots who had fought over Belgium and France were professional, experienced, and were preparing to cross the channel. They knew the range numbers. They had flown the missions. They understood, in the specific way that only pilots can understand, what 25 minutes of combat fuel means when the sea you have to cross to get home is 40 kilometers wide, and the water temperature is cold enough to kill within minutes of immersion. They flew anyway. The fuel figures said they should have been given an entirely different aircraft for an entirely different kind of campaign. The fuel figures were in von Seidel's desk. They were never, in any document I have found, the subject of a formal operational review that reached the level where a decision might have been made. The arithmetic waited, as it always does. Chapter 6. The Channel as a Mirror. Radar, the Doubting System, and what the Luftwaffe never understood. Summer 1940. Somewhere in the German Federal Archive at Freiburg, under an archival reference for Luftwaffe air intelligence documents from the pre-war period, there is a report dated the 16th of November, 1939. It was produced by the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch, the IC section, under the direction of Oberstleutnant Josef Schmid, and it addresses, among other subjects, the nature and operational significance of the radar network that had been observed along the English coastline. The report is thorough in its data collection. It correctly identifies that Britain has established a chain of transmitter stations, producing electromagnetic pulses, capable of detecting aircraft at ranges of approximately 160 kilometers. It notes the antenna configurations. It estimates the operating frequencies. It identifies the ground stations associated with the network. And then, on page 12, it draws a conclusion that is, in the context of what actually happened in the summer of 1940, one of the most consequential intelligence errors in the history of air warfare. The report states that the processing and relay of radar data from detection to actionable intelligence likely takes between 10 and 15 minutes, and therefore the information would be, in Schmidt's assessment, obsolete before it could be acted upon. The actual processing time of the Doubting System, from first radar contact to fighter squadron scramble order, was approximately 8 minutes. The gap between Schmid's 15 and reality's 8 was the gap that saved Britain. The chain-home radar network that Schmid was attempting to analyze in November of 1939 was, by the standards of 1940 technology, an imperfect instrument. It operated on long wavelengths of between 10 and 13 meters. Primitive by comparison with the centimetric radar systems that would appear later in the war. Its antenna arrays were fixed. They could not rotate to track a target, which meant that determining precise bearing required skilled interpretation of overlapping signal pulses rather than direct measurement. Its range estimation was reasonably accurate, but required operator skill to extract from what appeared on the cathode ray screens as a series of signal humps of varying amplitude. Any honest technical assessment of chain home would describe it as a system that demanded significant human skill to operate effectively, and that produced outputs less precise than a well-designed modern system would have generated from the same physical information. Schmid saw the antenna towers, understood approximately what they were doing, and made a reasonable error. He assumed that a technically mediocre system would produce mediocre operational results. What he missed, what the entire Luftwaffe intelligence apparatus missed, consistently and completely, was that the value of chain home was not in the technology. It was in the architecture. The radar stations were connected, via dedicated landline telephone networks, to a hierarchy of filter rooms, sector operations rooms, and the central operations room at Bentley Priory in Stanmore. Each layer of that hierarchy had specific, practiced, standardized procedures for receiving data, assessing it, and passing instructions to the next layer. The chain from radar operator to scrambled fighter squadron had been rehearsed, timed, and refined over 3 years of exercises before the first German aircraft crossed the English coast. You couldn't jam the architecture. You couldn't destroy it with a single bombing raid. It wasn't in any one building. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had built the system that bore his name with a specific operational logic, that the defending fighter force was smaller than the attacking force and could not afford to patrol wastefully, so every scramble had to be precisely vectored and precisely timed. The WAAF plotters, Women's Auxiliary Air Force personnel, who moved the marker tokens across the large-scale maps in the sector operations rooms, were not decorative elements of a high-tech stage set. They were the human operating system of a real-time information processing network. Their precision mattered. Their speed mattered. The standardization of their procedures mattered. An interview recording from a WAAF plotter, preserved in the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive, describes the work as intensely physical in its concentration, moving tokens, receiving telephone updates, maintaining situational awareness of the entire airspace picture simultaneously, while the controllers at the edge of the table called vectors to pilots already airborne. The women doing this work were not trained pilots, not fighter aces, not figures who appear in the standard heroic narrative of the Battle of Britain. They were the system. And the system was what the Luftwaffe had failed to understand it was fighting. On the 12th of August, 1940, the day the German High Command designated Adlertag, the opening of the Eagle's attack, the Luftwaffe struck 6 chain-home radar stations along the southern English coast. 5 were damaged. 1, at Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, was put completely off the air. The results of these strikes were, by any tactical standard, significant. And then, with a completeness that continues to puzzle analysts of the campaign, the Luftwaffe stopped attacking the radar stations. The reasoning, documented in post-battle German intelligence assessments, was that the stations appeared to return to operation too quickly to represent a structurally important target category. The Ventnor station appeared on the German tracking systems as if it had resumed operation within hours of the attack. The inference drawn was that the stations were either quickly repaired or backed up in ways that made them redundant. The inference was partially correct, but the specific reason for the apparent rapid resumption, that chain home stations were deliberately built with distributed transmitter and receiver arrays, so that damage to one antenna element did not take down the whole station, was never identified. The Luftwaffe's intelligence system saw the effect and drew the wrong conclusion from it. The one moment during the Battle of Britain when the German Air Force had the opportunity to genuinely degrade the Dowding system's effectiveness was abandoned after a single day, based on an analytical error that a more thorough understanding of the system's architecture would have prevented. The peak attrition figures from the battle's most intense phase tell a story that the standard narratives often reduce to a simple equation of bravery against numbers. During the period from the 8th of August through the 6th of September 1940, the phase of sustained attacks on airfields and sector stations, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,000 aircraft destroyed or written off. RAF Fighter Command lost approximately 466 in the same period. The ratio, more than 2 to 1 against the Germans, is often cited as evidence of RAF tactical superiority, and it does reflect real tactical advantages. But the ratio also reflects something more specific, the Dowding system's geometric efficiency. When a controller at a sector operations room vectors a squadron to an intercept that is calculated calculated from track data rather than estimated from a patrolling pilot's visual scan. The intercept geometry is more precise. Precise intercept geometry means more engagements, and more engagements means a higher aggregate exchange rate. The chain home network and its human operators were, in effect, multiplying the fighting power of each RAF aircraft by reducing the energy it wasted reaching combat. The Luftwaffe was fighting a numbers game it didn't know it was playing, against an opponent whose real advantage wasn't courage or aircraft quality. It was a telephone exchange procedure. It fascinates me, and I want to be honest that this is a personal response to the documents rather than a formal analytical claim. How thoroughly the Luftwaffe's intelligence failure over British radar illustrates the difference between collecting information and understanding it. Schmid's 1939 report collected real data. The antenna towers existed. The frequencies were approximately correct. The detection ranges were assessed reasonably accurately. Everything in the factual section of the report was more or less right. The failure was entirely at the interpretive level. The step from "here is what exists" to "here is what it does and why it matters." And that interpretive failure wasn't random. It was shaped by a specific assumption that British technology, like British production and British tactical doctrine, was probably lagging behind German standards, and that a less sophisticated technology would produce proportionally less effective results. The assumption was wrong, but it was consistent. It was the same assumption that produced the inflated kill claims in Spain, the same assumption that shaped the post-Poland overconfidence, the same institutional tendency to evaluate opponents downward that had characterized Luftwaffe intelligence work from the beginning. The error at Ventnor on the 12th of August was not a one-day tactical mistake. It was the most recent expression of a much older analytical habit. On the night of the 24th of August, 1940, a navigation error by a Heinkel bomber crew, precise details of the crew's identity and their specific technical failure not established in the records, resulted in bombs falling on residential areas of central London. The bombs were not aimed at the city. The crew, almost certainly lost in the dark and uncertain of their actual position, released over what they believed was a secondary target, away from civilian areas. Churchill, informed of the bombs on London, ordered retaliation strikes on Berlin. The Berlin raids that followed were militarily ineffective against German industry. They were not designed to be. They were designed to force a political response. The response came in the form of Hitler's decision, announced at a public rally with characteristic rhetorical fury, to shift the Luftwaffe's attacks away from RAF airfields and sector stations and toward the city of London itself. The operational consequence of that decision was that Fighter Command, which had been absorbing serious damage to its sector operations infrastructure throughout August, was given a reprieve. The airfields that Göring's bombers had been systematically degrading were now left unmolested while the bombers flew toward London. Dowding used the reprieve to repair, resupply, and rest. The RAF's Hugh Dowding had been saved by a navigation error, a political decision, and a man who could not resist the theater of vengeance. None of that appears in the aircraft specifications or the pilot training records, but it was, in terms of operational consequence, as significant as anything that happened in the air. Dowding's position within his own Air Force in the summer of 1940 is one of the details of the battle that I find clarifying in ways that popular accounts tend to obscure. He had submitted his resignation to the Air Ministry in June of 1940, not under any operational pressure, but because the Air Ministry had twice extended his retirement date and then reversed the decision, leaving him uncertain whether he would still be in command when the battle he had spent 3 years preparing for actually arrived. The letter of resignation is in the National Archives, filed in the Air Ministry correspondence folders. It was not accepted. Had it been, command of Fighter Command would have passed to a successor who had not personally built the system and might not have had the institutional confidence to resist pressure from Churchill and the air staff to commit all available squadrons to forward battle without reserve. Dowding's practice of holding squadrons back, of rotating tired units out of the battle, and refusing to commit his reserve in ways that might have looked bolder in the short term, but would have been catastrophically costly in the medium term, was consistently argued against by figures inside and outside Fighter Command. He maintained it because he understood the arithmetic of his system better than anyone else did. The battle was not won by the man who built the radar. It was won, in a very specific operational sense, by the man who understood how to use it, and who remained in command to do so because an administrative letter was not acted upon. By the 15th of September 1940, the date that has become fixed in British memory as Battle of Britain Day, the day RAF Fighter Command flew over 1,200 sorties against German formations. The battle's outcome was, in retrospect, already determined. Goering's report to Hitler that the RAF was reduced to its last 50 fighters was not a misread of ambiguous intelligence. It was a preference stated as a fact, in a command culture that had organized itself around preferences rather than facts. The RAF's actual operational strength on that date was approximately 750 aircraft. The gap between 50 and 750 is not a measurement error. It is the institutionalized wishful thinking of an intelligence system that had never been asked to be honest and had long since stopped trying. The number Goering gave Hitler was the number he needed the RAF to have for his guarantee. The guarantee that the Luftwaffe could finish the job, that the ground invasion was unnecessary, that the campaign would succeed, to remain operationally credible. The number that existed in reality bore no relationship to what he said. In a system with functioning upward information flow, someone would have corrected him. In the system that actually existed, the correction was never delivered. The Battle of Britain ended in the autumn of 1940, not with a formal declaration or a specific last engagement, but with the progressive diminishment of daylight, large formation attacks, replaced by night bombing campaigns that the Luftwaffe had not planned for and was only partially equipped to execute. In Schmidt's post-battle intelligence review, filed in November of 1940, a year after the report that had misidentified the radar's operational significance. The failure of the campaign is attributed to unexpectedly high RAF fighter reserves. The RAF reserves had been clearly visible in the operational data throughout the summer. They had been visible in the exchange rate figures, in the sortie numbers, in every quantitative measurement available to a functioning intelligence system. They were unexpected only because the system that should have expected them had been built from its earliest documents around the practice of confirming assumptions rather than challenging them. The same Schmid who had dismissed the radar network's operational significance in November of 1939 was, 12 months later, expressing surprise at the results that a functioning radar network had produced. The methodology had not changed, only the consequences had. Chapter 7. Goering's Disgrace. How one man's ego wrote the battle's obituary. The 3rd of August, 1940. Somewhere in The Hague, in a requisitioned Dutch government building, Hermann Goering convened a conference with his Luftwaffe commanders. The summer outside was warm and clear, the kind of flying weather that operational planners dream about. The campaign against Britain had been underway for several weeks in preliminary form, and the major assault was being finalized. The commanders who sat around the table that afternoon, Kesselring commanding Luftwaffe 2, Sperle commanding Luftwaffe 3, Stumpf commanding Luftwaffe 5 from Norway, were professional airmen with genuine operational experience. They had built careers, they had studied their craft, and they had thoughts about how the coming battle should be conducted. Those thoughts were not, in any documented sense, welcome. The conference at The Hague on the 3rd of August 1940 was not a planning meeting. It was an announcement. Goering had already decided what would happen. The commanders were there to receive the decisions, not to shape them. In Albert Kesselring's personal copy of the operational order that emerged from the Hague Conference, preserved in the German Federal Archive at Freiburg under a reference in the Luftwaffe 2 command files, the document is stamped and countersigned in the normal military fashion. It is, in its formal presentation, a routine command document, but on the margin next to a specific clause, the clause ordering Bf-109 fighters to fly in close escort formation with the bomber streams, rather than in the free hunting sweeps that every experienced German fighter commander unanimously preferred. Someone has written 2 words in pencil and then attempted, with incomplete success, to erase them. Under oblique light, the words remain legible. They translate as, nonsense, why? The handwriting doesn't match Kesselring's. Who wrote it is unknown. That it was written, and then someone thought better of leaving it visible, and then the erasure proved insufficient. That sequence tells you nearly everything you need to know about the culture of the Luftwaffe's command structure in the summer of 1940. The close escort order was a decision with immediate, measurable, and entirely predictable operational consequences. The Bf-109E had been designed by Willy Messerschmitt and his team around a 1934 specification that optimized two things above all others: speed and climb rate. The airframe was deliberately small and light. The fuel capacity was deliberately limited, because fuel is weight, and weight is the enemy of speed and climb. What the close escort order required was that this precisely optimized high-performance fighter reduce its airspeed to approximately 390 kilometers per hour, roughly 85% of its normal cruise, and maintain station above slow-moving Heinkel and Dornier bomber formations at medium altitude, weaving continuously to avoid overrunning the slower aircraft ahead. At reduced speed, the Bf-109 lost its primary tactical advantage, the ability to dive through a formation, accelerate away, and climb back to altitude for another pass. At medium altitude, it lost its secondary advantage, the ceiling performance that allowed it to position above RAF fighters and control the engagement geometry. The close escort order didn't just constrain the fighter. It removed, one by one, every characteristic that made it dangerous. The fuel arithmetic of the close escort requirement compounded the tactical degradation in ways that the operations planning staff appear not to have formally quantified. The continuous weaving pattern required to stay with the bomber formations increased fuel consumption per kilometer of escort duty by approximately 23% above the straight-line cruise figure. On a mission from Pas-de-Calais bases to the London area and back, this 23% additional consumption eliminated whatever marginal combat time remained after accounting for the basic range limitation. The pilots were arriving over the target area with roughly 15 to 20 minutes of fuel remaining before they had to turn for home. Not 25 minutes, as the range calculations alone suggested, but 15 to 20 because the weaving had eaten the difference. They knew this. It was not a calculation they needed instruments to perform. Every Bf-109 pilot on escort duty in August and September of 1940 understood, from the fuel gauge in front of him, exactly how much time he had before the arithmetic became fatal. What they could not change was the order that had put them in that position. Adolf Galland's memoir, written and published in 1954, contains what has become perhaps the most quoted exchange in Luftwaffe history. Goering, frustrated by the continuing losses and the Luftwaffe's inability to destroy fighter command, asks his fighter aces what they need to win the battle. Galland replies that he would like a squadron of Spitfires. In most accounts, this is treated as a piece of characteristic fighter pilot insolence, a cheeky remark from a young ace who knew how to irritate his superior. That reading misses what is actually being said. Galland's request was technically precise. The Spitfire 1 and 2 had a combat radius from southern English bases of approximately 500 kilometers, sufficient to provide meaningful escort coverage over a substantial portion of the Channel approach, without the range-induced time pressure that made the Bf-109's escort role operationally incoherent. What Galland was describing, in the compressed language of a man who understood the problem from cockpit experience, was an aircraft that could do the job the close escort order required, without the fuel constraint that made the job impossible. That Goering received this as an insult and walked out of the room is, from an analytical standpoint, less interesting than the fact that Galland was right. When I go through Kesselring's post-war memoirs, alongside his wartime operational records, the portrait that emerges is of a man who was simultaneously loyal to his institutional hierarchy and quietly appalled by its decision-making. His published memoir from 1953 is diplomatically phrased, the language of a professional soldier who has thought carefully about what he can say and what he cannot. But even through the diplomatic phrasing, the assessment of Goering's command style is devastating. Kesselring describes operational conferences in which the Reichsmarshal arrived with conclusions already formed and departed before the implications could be examined. He describes intelligence assessments that confirmed Goering's preferences and intelligence officers who had learned to produce confirming assessments. He describes a command culture in which the acceptable range of advice to offer a superior had been progressively narrowed, until the only professionally safe position was agreement. The controlled restraint of Kesselring's language in these passages makes them more damning, not less. A man who liked Goering would have defended him more warmly. A man who despised him would have attacked more directly. The careful neutrality of Kesselring's prose is the tone of a professional describing a structural failure that he witnessed but could not prevent. The 19th of August, 1940, marks a decision that the Luftwaffe's operational records describe as a refinement of targeting priorities, but that, read against the context of what was happening to Fighter Command's sector infrastructure at that point, was something more significant, an institutional acknowledgement of failure dressed in bureaucratic language. Goering's reorganization of Luftwaffe 3 to focus primarily on night bombing operations effectively transferred that force out of the daylight air superiority campaign. The official framing did not present it as a retreat from the primary objective, but the effect was that a significant portion of the bomber force available for the Battle of Britain was now committed to operations that could not, by definition, contribute to the destruction of RAF Fighter Command's day-fighting capability. The battle's actual strategic objective, establishing sufficient air superiority to allow an invasion of Britain, required the destruction of the doubting system. Night bombing of English cities did not contribute to that objective. It relieved pressure on Fighter Command sector stations while killing civilians. The reorganization was, in operational terms, a choice to do something achievable instead of something necessary. The question of whether the shift to bombing London on the 7th of September 1940, the moment traditionally identified as the pivot that saved Fighter Command, was primarily Hitler's decision, or Goering's, is one that the documentary record addresses with more precision than popular accounts suggest. The operational order for the London shift flows from Goering's headquarters, with Hitler's approval notation added subsequently, a sequencing that suggests Goering initiated the change and Hitler endorsed it, rather than Hitler directing and Goering implementing. The Luftwaffe 2 War Diary entry for the relevant date shows the order originating from the Reichsmarshal's operational staff and moving upward for political confirmation, rather than downward from political direction. This sequencing matters because it changes the accountability structure. The narrative of Hitler overriding military judgment is a recurring and sometimes accurate feature of German wartime decision-making. But in this specific instance, the documentary evidence suggests the military leadership made the operational choice first. The convenience of Hitler's endorsement is real. So is the convenience, for post-war accounts, of placing primary responsibility on Hitler rather than on the Air Force that had been losing the battle it had promised to win. The 15th of September of 1940 entered British national memory as the day the RAF repelled the largest German air assault of the battle, a claim that is broadly true, with the caveat that the specific narrative of that day's events was shaped partly by real-time reporting from a Churchill who was watching the battle unfold from the sector operations room and who understood, with the instincts of a political communicator, what the day needed to mean. The operational records show Fighter Command flying approximately 1,200 sorties, and the Luftwaffe losing 60 aircraft, the RAF losing 26. Goering's report to Hitler in the aftermath of that day estimated the RAF was down to its last 50 fighters. The actual figure, as any reader of Keith Park's sector strength returns would know, was approximately 750 operational aircraft. The gap between 50 and 750 is a number that requires explanation. The explanation available in the German intelligence files is not reassuring. It isn't that the intelligence was gathered and misinterpreted, it's that it wasn't gathered at all. Schmid's intelligence staff was producing estimates calibrated to Goering's preferences rather than to the available evidence. The 50 fighters figure was not an assessment, it was a wish, formatted as a briefing. By late September of 1940, the Battle of Britain was over in any meaningful operational sense, though the calendar would not formally close the campaign for several more weeks. The Luftwaffe had failed to establish air superiority over southern England. The invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. The Air Force that had appeared to the world and to itself as the dominant instrument of a new kind of warfare had been stopped, at the cost of over 1,000 aircraft and hundreds of experienced pilots, by an opponent it had systematically underestimated and structurally misunderstood. The post-battle intelligence review, filed in November of 1940, attributed the failure to factors outside the Luftwaffe's control, to RAF reserve depth that no intelligence assessment had predicted, to weather, to the inherent difficulties of the operational environment over the Channel. The close escort order that had neutered the Bf-109 does not appear as a primary causal factor. The inadequate intelligence architecture does not appear as a primary causal factor. The fuel calculations that made the whole campaign geometrically problematic before the first aircraft crossed the coast do not appear as primary causal factors. The after-action report protected the institution. The institution learned precisely nothing from its first major defeat. What the Battle of Britain left behind, beyond the aircraft wreckage scattered across Kent and Sussex and the Channel floor, was a set of unresolved institutional questions that the Luftwaffe's command structure was constitutionally incapable of addressing. The close escort order remained in force longer than operational evidence justified it. The intelligence system that had produced the 50 fighters estimate was not reformed. Schmid remained in his position. Goering remained in his. The Bf-109E, with its 25-minute combat window, remained the primary fighter. The men who had written "nonsense, why?" in the margins of operational orders had erased their words and gone back to work. The system had received a significant defeat and had responded by producing paperwork that explained the defeat in ways that preserved the system's self-conception. That is not what a learning institution looks like. It is what an institution looks like when it has decided, at the level of its deepest organizational culture, that self-knowledge is more dangerous than ignorance. Chapter 8, The Four-Engine Ghost, Germany's Strategic Bombing That Never Was. In the German Federal Archive at Freiburg, in the files of the Reichsluftfahrtministerium's Technical Correspondence Series, there is a letter dated the 12th of November, 1937. It is a formal document from the Aviation Ministry's Technical Office, addressed to the Heinkel Aircraft Company, and it contains a requirement that is, once you understand what it is demanding, almost physically painful to read. The new heavy bomber that Germany needed, the aircraft that would eventually be designated the Heinkel HE-177, was required to demonstrate a dive attack at an angle of 60 degrees, at a terminal velocity of not less than 600 kilometers per hour. Not a shallow glide, not a moderate dive, a 60-degree dive at high speed, the kind of maneuver required of a Ju-87 Stuka, demanded of an aircraft with the weight and wingspan of a four-engine strategic bomber. On Heinkel's file copy of this letter, preserved in the same archive, a company engineer has written in pencil in the margin, "The DB606 coupling cannot sustain this load." There is a reference to stress calculations in an appendix. The appendix is not attached to the surviving file copy. Whether it was removed, misfiled, or never formally submitted is not established in the documents. The warning was written. It appears to have been read by no one who could have acted on it. The specification remained. Ernst Heinkel's memoir, published in West Germany in 1956, is a complicated document to use as a primary source. Heinkel is writing partly as a businessman defending his professional legacy, partly as an engineer explaining decisions he made under political and commercial pressure, and partly as a man who wants history to understand that he told them so. The memoir's self-justifying passages require careful handling, but the underlying engineering narrative, the specific sequence of decisions that produced the He-177's notorious engine arrangement, is corroborated in sufficient detail by the RLM correspondence files to use as a framework. The problem the designers faced was this. The specification required a four-engine aircraft with the aerodynamic profile of a twin-engine aircraft, the range of a long-distance bomber, and the dive capability of a Stuka. These requirements were not merely in tension with each other, they were mutually exclusive in the engineering mathematics of 1937. You could have three of them. You could not have all four. The solution that was ultimately imposed, coupling two Daimler-Benz 601 engines on a single shared drive shaft, creating a unit designated the DB606, which would occupy the space and present the frontal area of a single large engine, was not derived from engineering analysis. It was derived from administrative necessity. The specification said twin-engine appearance. The range requirement said four-engine power. The coupling was the answer to an equation that should have been refused. The thermal physics of the DB606 arrangement were not mysterious. Two engines sharing an oil circuit, a cooling gallery, and a crankcase enclosure designed for one unit would generate heat concentrations in the firewall area that exceeded the thermal tolerance of the magnesium alloy used in the crankcase housing. At high power settings, oil temperatures in the shared gallery could reach levels at which that alloy began to lose structural integrity. A softened crankcase cannot maintain bearing tolerances. bearing surfaces and metal-to-metal contact in an engine producing over 1,750 horsepower, generates sufficient heat to reach the flashpoint of aviation fuel vapor in the engine bay within less than a minute. This is not a failure mode that requires negligent maintenance or substandard manufacturing. It is a thermodynamic sequence that follows from the basic physics of the coupling arrangement, predictable from first principles by any competent engineer, with access to the relevant material specifications. Heinkel's stress calculations in the missing Appendix C presumably showed this. The specification remained. The aircraft was built, and within the first weeks of frontline deployment, the operational units that received it gave it a nickname that required no translation: the Flying Reichleiter. The Junkers Jumo 211 series engine, which powered the Ju-88 and the He-111 with reasonable reliability, had established by the early 1940s a service life of approximately 240 hours before major overhaul. This figure set a baseline expectation for Luftwaffe maintenance planning: a certain number of engine changes per aircraft per operational month, a certain stock of spare engines required at forward depots, a certain number of maintenance man-hours allocated per flying hour. The He-177's DB-606, in frontline service conditions, demonstrated a consistent pattern of failure significantly before any comparable figure. The first 10 aircraft assigned to the Long-Range Maritime Patrol Unit, Kampfgeschwader 40, suffered 6 engine fires in the first month of operations. 3 aircraft were destroyed. The unit's war diary records the events with the flat precision of a document that is trying very hard not to say what it obviously wants to say. Milch's response, documented in his diary, was to request an emergency redesign of the cooling and oil systems. Udet's response, also documented, was to suggest that the aircraft required better trained mechanics. Udet was wrong in a way that the thermodynamics make inarguable. The mechanics could not, with any amount of training, change the heat capacity of magnesium alloy. The 4-engine strategic bombing capability that Walther Wever had championed, the ability to carry a sustained bombing campaign to targets deep inside the Soviet Union, or deep inside any major industrial power that Germany might eventually fight, had been, in the years following his death in 1936, progressively abandoned as an operational priority. It had not been abandoned through a formal decision. There was no conference, no signed directive, no moment at which the Luftwaffe formally said that strategic bombing was no longer a German Air Force mission. It was abandoned by accumulation, by the Condor Legion's tactical lessons, by Udet's dive-bombing obsession, by the budgetary and political pressures of fast rearmament, by the He-177's engine fires, and by the institutional absence of anyone senior enough and sufficiently secure in his position to argue consistently for the capability that Wever had described. The program died in the way that institutional failures often die, not with a decision but with a series of deferrals, each individually explicable, none individually decisive, accumulating over time into an outcome that no single actor had chosen, but that the system had, in effect, selected. What strikes me most when I read the He-177 development files alongside the production cost records is the sheer scale of investment that Germany poured into an aircraft that was, from its foundational specification, almost certainly unable to perform its intended role reliably. By the middle of the war, the program had consumed over 1 billion Reichsmarks and produced over 1,000 aircraft of which, on any given operational day, perhaps a third to a half could be considered serviceable. The engineering talent that Heinkel's teams expended on successive attempts to solve the cooling and oil problems, attempts that produced incremental improvements but never resolved the fundamental thermodynamic issue, was engineering talent that was not available for other development work. The factory capacity that produced each 177s was factory capacity that was not producing aircraft with reliable engines. The program persisted, partly because the sunk cost made cancellation politically difficult, and partly because the official position was that the next modification series would finally solve the problem. The next modification series never finally solved the problem. I've spent time with the comparison that imposes itself here, because it is genuinely clarifying rather than merely dramatic. In Britain,
the Avro Manchester,
a twin-engine heavy bomber powered by the deeply unreliable Rolls-Royce Vulture
Luftwaffe,
engine, was entering service at roughly the same time the HE-177 was encountering its first operational disasters. The Manchester was a failure. Its engines were underpowered and prone to failure in ways that made sustained bomber operations difficult and crew survival uncertain. The RAF recognized the failure, and Roy Chadwick at Avro redesigned the aircraft's wing to accept 4 Merlin engines rather than 2 Vultures. The aircraft that resulted was the Lancaster. The Lancaster became the primary instrument of Bomber Command's strategic campaign against Germany. It flew until the end of the war, was produced in over 7,000 examples, and demonstrated a reliability and operational effectiveness that made it one of the most capable aircraft of the conflict. The contrast between the two programs is not a contrast of engineering talent. German engineers were not less capable than British ones. The contrast is institutional. When the Manchester failed, the RAF modified its design criteria and produced a better aircraft. When the HE-177's DB-606 caught fire, the Luftwaffe told its maintenance crews to train harder. By the autumn of 1942, Goering had ordered He-177s into service over Stalingrad for supply operations, a deployment made against the advice of the technical officers who understood the aircraft's limitations, and in the teeth of an operational environment that combined extreme cold, rough airfield surfaces, and the need for maximum engine power during takeoff and low-level flight. The cold created an additional problem that the design had not addressed. The magnesium alloy components that failed at high temperatures also became brittle at the extreme cold of the Russian winter, creating cracking patterns at rivet points that maintenance crews had to monitor continuously. An aircraft that was unreliable at normal temperatures became worse at minus 30 degrees Celsius. Crews flew it anyway. The war diary of the unit records 1 aircraft burning on landing at a forward airfield, in full view of other crews waiting to depart. The diary notes poor morale in He-177 units. Poor morale was the mildest possible way to describe the professional condition of air crews, being asked to fly aircraft that were as likely to destroy them as the enemy was. The total bomb tonnage delivered by all He-177 operational sorties across the entire duration of the war is estimated at approximately 32,000 tons. In the same period, the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force alone delivered over 1.5 million tons of bombs on European targets. The ratio, roughly 47 to 1, is not primarily an aircraft count problem. Germany had the factories. It had the industrial capacity, in theory, to produce a functional 4-engine bomber in the numbers required. What it did not have was the institutional mechanism to refuse a specification that was engineering nonsense, to overrule a procurement chief whose personal enthusiasm was corrupting technical judgment, to protect the engineering analysis in Appendix C from the organizational forces that ensured it was never read. The HE-177 was not an accident. It was the product of a system that had been designed, at its upper levels, to answer to preferences rather than to physics. Physics, as usual, was unimpressed. The He-177 program ended not with a formal cancellation, but with the progressive disorganization of German industry in the final year of the war, as Allied bombing and the collapse of the fuel and materials supply chains made all complex manufacturing increasingly difficult. The last production examples rolled off the line into a Luftwaffe that had no fuel to fly them, no trained pilots to crew them, and no operational infrastructure to support them. The aircraft that was supposed to give Germany a strategic bombing capability equivalent to Britain's Lancaster or America's B-1740 ended its production run as an expensive collection of components sitting on dispersal strips at factories behind the Allied front lines, waiting for an administrative order to stop production that no one was positioned to write. The ghost of a strategic capability that Walther Wever had argued for in the early 1930s, the ghost that had been killed first by an aileron lock in Dresden and then again by a dive-bombing specification in Berlin, had finally, completely exhausted its haunting. Chapter 9. Letters Home.
France.
The human cost of a pilot pipeline running dry, 1942.
On an unprecedented scale
the 12th of March, 1942. Somewhere in
bomber
Germany, at a
units on this
Luftwaffe
campaign
flying training station,
consisted
a
of
young
some
man named
1,000
Franz
who had grown
Stigler sits
sufficiently
down to
in
write a
strength,
letter to his mother in
and
Bavaria.
Hitler gave the
The
orders
letter is
to
written in
attack
pencil
Poland.
on the pale blue-gray paper that the
The
German
Luftwaffe
military postal
spearheading the
system
attack.
issued for correspondence home. The Feldpost paper that millions of families would come to recognize by touch before the war was over. The paper is thin. The handwriting is young and careful. The handwriting of someone who wants to be legible, who knows his mother will read this. He tells her that his training class has been informed that their final examination flights will be reduced from the scheduled 6 solo cross-country navigation exercises to 3. His instructor explained the reduction, he writes, and then Stigler adds a sentence that has stayed with me since I first encountered this letter in the archive. He writes that the instructor's voice, when making this announcement, was the voice of a man who cannot explain what he understands. That phrase, the voice of a man who cannot explain what he understands, is the sound of an institution in crisis, heard through a young man's letter to his mother. The Luftwaffe's pre-war pilot training program was, by the standards of 1938 and 1939, among the most demanding in the world. A pilot candidate who entered the system as a motivated young man with a glider club background would spend approximately 450 flight hours in the training pipeline before being considered ready for a frontline assignment. The curriculum included instrument flying, formation work, navigation over long distances, air-to-air gunnery, and the specific tactical procedures that the Condor Legion's operational experience had incorporated into standard doctrine. It was a long program. It was expensive in fuel, in instructor time, in aircraft hours, and it produced pilots who, when they arrived at their units, were genuinely capable of the full range of tasks that operational flying required. The program also produced the men who fought over Poland and France and Britain, the cadre of experienced aviators whose quality was the Luftwaffe's most important and least replaceable asset. When those men began dying at the rates that 1942 was generating, the training program that would have replaced them was already no longer capable of producing equivalent pilots. The compression had begun quietly in the aftermath of the Battle of Britain, and it had been accelerating ever since. The mechanism of the training compression is documented in the Luftwaffe Training Command's annual reports, in a way that is almost clinical in its precision and almost unbearable in its implications. The first reduction, from approximately 450 hours to approximately 280 hours, was introduced in the period following the Battle of Britain and presented as a temporary adjustment to operational pressures. The word temporary appears in the administrative documents. It was not temporary. The second compression, in the period following the opening of the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941, brought the figure to approximately 160 hours for fighter pilot candidates. The third compression, in the middle of 1942, brought it below 130. Each reduction was justified by operational necessity. The front needed pilots now. The training program was taking too long. The war couldn't wait for the curriculum. Each reduction was documented as a wartime exception. None were reversed. The curriculum had been designed as a system in which specific competencies were built sequentially, each stage depending on skills developed in the previous stage. When you cut the program in half and then cut it in half again, you don't produce a pilot who is half as good. You produce a pilot with specific, non-random gaps in capability, gaps in the precise skills that the stages you removed were designed to develop. The skill category most rapidly degraded by the training compression was instrument flying. This is a specific technical domain, the ability to navigate and control an aircraft entirely without visual reference to the ground, relying solely on the cockpit instruments, and it requires a particular kind of training investment that cannot be compressed without loss. Instrument flying proficiency needs approximately 60 to 80 dedicated hours of specific hood flying exercises, with a qualified instructor in the rear seat monitoring and correcting, before a pilot achieves the level of automatic response to instrument readings that constitutes genuine competence. Below that threshold, the pilot can perform instrument flying in calm conditions and known configurations. He cannot perform it reliably when disoriented, when the aircraft has been damaged, or when the workload of combat is demanding simultaneous attention to a dozen other things. These hours were among the first cut in 1942, because they were the most expensive to produce. Instructor time, dual-control aircraft, fuel, and because their absence was invisible in fair weather training conditions. A pilot with 40 hours of instrument training instead of 75 will perform indistinguishably from a fully qualified colleague on a clear day over a known airfield. Over Russia in December, in cloud at night with fighters behind him and a fuel warning light on, the difference becomes a matter of survival. The attrition numbers for 1943 are figures that I find myself returning to repeatedly because they are so far beyond any intuitive sense of sustainable loss that the mind resists them. In that single year, the Luftwaffe lost 2,961 fighter pilots, killed, captured, or missing. The average operational strength of the fighter arm throughout that same year was approximately 2,105 pilots. The Luftwaffe had lost, in 12 months, 140% of its average fighter pilot strength. It was replacing these losses with pilots who had, by mid-year, approximately 112 hours of total flight time. A figure that the pre-war Luftwaffe's own training regulations would have classified as insufficient for solo flight in poor weather. The fighter arm was consuming itself at a rate that made any concept of strategic reserve a mathematical fiction. There was no reserve. There were only the men currently flying, and behind them, the men currently training with insufficient hours, and behind them, nothing. When I was cross-referencing the training hour figures with the fuel allocation records for the training schools in this period, I found a detail that I don't think receives the attention it deserves in the standard histories. The single largest bottleneck in the Luftwaffe training pipeline in 1942 and 1943 was not aircraft, not qualified instructors, and not facilities. It was ball bearing availability for the Argus AS-10 engine, the piston engine fitted to the primary advanced training aircraft of that period. The same ball-bearing supply crisis that was constraining production of the Bf-109 on the frontline assembly lines was simultaneously constraining production of the training aircraft engines that would have produced the pilots to fly those Bf-109s. The supply chain failure was recursive and self-amplifying in a way that a systems analyst would recognize immediately, but that apparently no one in the Luftwaffe's administrative structure was mapping in its full extent. The factories that couldn't produce bearings for fighters also couldn't produce bearings for trainers. The pilots who would have been qualified by those trainers never reached the front. The frontline units that would have been staffed by those pilots were chronically understrength. The understrength units flew their remaining experienced pilots harder to compensate. The harder flying killed the experienced pilots faster. The faster deaths increased the demand on the training pipeline. The pipeline was constrained by bearing availability. The bearings were constrained by Schweinfurt. Stigler's letters from the spring and summer of 1942 trace a careful, inadvertent documentary of what it felt like to be inside this system as a participant rather than an analyst. He doesn't write about strategy. He doesn't write about production curves or training hour statistics. He writes about the specific texture of his days. The aircraft he is flying, the weather over the training field, the meals in the barracks, the friends he's made, the ones he's lost. In a letter from early summer, he describes his first engagement with an enemy aircraft in terms that are entirely physical. The specific movements of the controls, the way the aircraft responded, the moment when he understood that what he had been taught was both sufficient and, in some crucial respect, not quite enough. His description of that gap between training and reality is not self-pitying or dramatic. It is observational. He is noting something he has noticed. He doesn't have a framework for understanding why the gap exists. He simply knows it does. The framework is in von Seidel's fuel reports and the training command's annual figures. Stigler was living inside the problem that those documents describe, the psychological dimension of the training crisis, the impact on the men flying with insufficient preparation, and the men instructing them under impossible conditions. Rarely appears in the operational documents, because operational documents are not designed to capture psychological information. But it surfaces occasionally in the peripheral sources. Unit diaries contain brief, carefully phrased references to morale concerns and fatigue among aircrew. Medical reports from Luftwaffe base hospitals in this period document elevated incidences of what the medical language of the time called combat fatigue, stress responses that we would now classify with more precise diagnostic language, but that were clearly related to the compounded pressure of high operational tempo, inadequate preparation, and the specific psychological burden of watching colleagues who had been flying for less than 4 months die on missions that more experienced pilots would have survived. The instructors were, in many cases, men who had flown in Spain or Poland or France, and who understood precisely what they were sending their students toward, and precisely why the students were not ready. The instructor's voice, in Stigler's letter, the voice of a man who cannot explain what he understands, is the voice of someone who knows the arithmetic and cannot change it. The compression of pilot training in the German military system has a specific comparison that makes its consequences vivid. By contrast with the Luftwaffe's 1943 standard of approximately 112 hours for fighter pilot candidates, the United States Army Air Forces was, by the same period, training its fighter pilots to approximately 400 hours before frontline assignment, and the American system was expanding, with more instructors, more training aircraft, and more fuel allocated to the program every month. The disparity was not simply a matter of having more resources, it was a matter of strategic intention. American planners had looked at the First World War's attrition patterns, studied the early phases of the current conflict, and concluded that the war would be decided partly by the quality of the human beings flying the aircraft. The investment in training was therefore not a support function that could be reduced under operational pressure. It was a primary strategic investment, protected even when it was inconvenient. The Luftwaffe had made the opposite choice, not through formal strategic decision, but through the accumulation of operational pressures that were never resisted, never formally evaluated, and never reversed. The last entry in the fragment of Stigler's letters available in the archive from this period is written in late summer of 1942. By this point, he has been in a frontline unit for several months. He is alive. He is clearly aware, in a way that the earlier letters were not, that this aliveness is a condition with a specific and uncertain duration. He mentions 2 names, friends from training, who are no longer in the unit. He mentions no details. He then writes, with a directness that the earlier letters didn't have, that he thinks about his training often, and that he believes he was given what he needed to survive, but perhaps not what his classmates needed. That sentence, the survivor's calculation, made at 21 years old, is the most honest accounting of the training compression available in the primary sources. Not the statistics, not the fuel tables, not the administrative memoranda. A young man's letter to his mother, written on feldpost paper, noting that he survived and his classmates didn't, and trying to understand the difference without the documents that would have explained it. Chapter 10. Gotterdammerung at Stalingrad. The airlift that killed the Luftwaffe's spine, winter 1942 to 1943. The 18th of December, 1942. Somewhere east of the Don River, at a forward Luftwaffe headquarters under enormous operational pressure, Wolfram von Richthofen sits down to send a teletype message. He has stopped using the telephone for recommendations to his superiors in Berlin because his telephone recommendations are being ignored, and in some cases, reversed, and then presented back to him as directives he had never endorsed. He knows the teletype creates a written record. He is sending 4 pages. In the final paragraph of that message, a paragraph that has been quoted in the secondary literature, and that has the quality of a man saying something important very carefully, he notes that he has asked for orders on the conduct of operations, because recently he has received only criticism rather than directives, and that probably the staff in Berlin were themselves without a sense of what to do. The word probably is doing more work in that sentence than any single word should have to do. Von Richthofen was one of the most capable operational commanders the Luftwaffe produced in the entire war. On the 18th of December, 1942, he was writing teletype messages to create evidence because he had lost confidence in his institution's ability to function honestly. The promise that destroyed the Stalingrad garrison was made by Hermann Göring in November of 1942, and it was made with full knowledge of the figures that made it impossible. When Soviet armies completed the encirclement of the German 6th Army in the last days of November, the question of whether the trapped forces could be supplied by air rather than by a ground release became the operational question on which hundreds of thousands of lives would turn. Luftwaffe 4's staff, led by von Richthofen, produced an immediate assessment. The maximum daily airlift capacity achievable with available aircraft was approximately 350 tons per day in ideal conditions. 6th Army's stated minimum requirement to sustain its forces in the pocket was 600 tons per day. The gap between 350 and 600 was not a gap that additional effort or improved organization could close. It was a fundamental physical limitation of the transport force available. The number of aircraft, their carrying capacity, and the distance from the forward bases to the pocket. Von Richthofen communicated this assessment to his superiors. His superiors communicated it upward, and then Göring, in a meeting with Hitler, guaranteed that the Luftwaffe could supply 6th Army. The Chief of Staff, Jeschonek, who had been present for von Richthofen's warnings, said nothing. His silence was the decision. The Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft that would constitute the primary airlift vehicle was a sturdy and capable machine that had been serving the Luftwaffe since the early years of the rearmament. Its corrugated duralumin skin, a design feature that attracted mockery from more aerodynamically refined contemporaries, was actually a sophisticated structural solution for resisting torsional stress and turbulence. But the material had a characteristic that was not relevant to its commercial airline service and very relevant to Russian winter operations. At temperatures below approximately minus 25 degrees Celsius, duralumin becomes significantly more brittle, and the corrugated skin sections are prone to cracking at rivet points. When the aircraft undergoes the thermal cycling of being operated, allowed to cool fully in open conditions, and then operated again, maintenance crews at the forward airfields reported these cracks consistently. The minimum safe procedure was 4 to 6 hours in a heated hangar before reoperation, after full cold soaking. The forward airfields in the winter of 1942 did not have heated hangars. They had open dispersal areas, inadequate ground equipment, and maintenance crews working in conditions that made sustained precision work nearly impossible. The aircraft were being asked to perform in an environment that their design specifications had not anticipated, and their maintenance infrastructure could not support. The fuel and serviceability figures from the airlift operation, recorded in von Richthofen's daily reports, tell a story of progressive deterioration that makes the outcome feel less like a dramatic catastrophe and more like the grinding resolution of an arithmetic problem that had been running since November 23rd. On most days of the airlift, the delivered tonnage hovered around 100 tons, 1/6 of 6th Army's minimum requirement, and less than a third of the theoretical maximum that Göring's guarantee had implied. On 3 days only, the 7th, the 21st, and the 31st of December, did deliveries exceed 300 tons. On some days, weather and aircraft serviceability combined to prevent any deliveries at all. Inside the pocket, the caloric allocation per soldier fell progressively through December and into January. The horses of the transport units were eaten first, then the reserve supplies, then the emergency reserves. Von Richthofen's teletype messages from this period constitute one of the most complete real-time records of an institutional failure available in the German military archive. A senior commander documented, day by day and with escalating precision, the gap between what was being promised in Berlin and what was physically possible in Russia. The loss of Tatsinskaya airfield on the 24th of December, 1942, transformed an already desperate situation into a catastrophic one. Soviet armored units overran the primary forward operating base in a movement that German intelligence had either not detected or not communicated with sufficient urgency. Flying units escaped by minutes, their aircraft getting airborne ahead of the tanks. Several loaded Ju-52s were trapped on the ground and burned by their own crews to prevent capture. Göring, notified of the situation, refused permission to abandon the airfield until tanks were actually on the runway, a decision that cost additional aircraft and very nearly trapped the personnel who were trying to get out. By the time the burning field was finally abandoned and the operation relocated to the next available base at Morozovskaya, the distance from the pocket to the nearest forward airfield had increased by roughly 100 kilometers. Each additional kilometer of distance reduced payload because fuel consumption increased, and reduced the number of sorties possible per day because each flight took longer. The mathematics of the airlift, already insoluble, became more insoluble with every kilometer the Soviets advanced. When I was reading through von Richthofen's diary entries from this period, the full diary, not the selected excerpts that appear in the secondary literature, I was struck by the way the prose changes over the course of December and into January. The early entries are those of a professional under pressure, terse and precise, noting operational conditions and resource states with the economy of a man who has been writing operational diaries for years. By mid-December, the entries are longer, more discursive, and contain passages that don't appear in most reproductions. Passages that are less operational summary and more something closer to a senior officer's private attempt to make sense of what is happening around him. He writes about conversations with army commanders. He writes about the gap between the instructions coming from Berlin and the situation he can see from where he is standing. He writes, in one passage that I find genuinely affecting, about his certainty that certain things he has reported have been altered before being passed upward, that the information flowing towards Hitler is not the information he is providing. The institution's information system is lying. He knows it. He documents knowing it. He keeps sending the teletype messages anyway. By February of 1943, when the last survivors of the 6th Army surrendered, and Paulus, who had been promoted to Field Marshal 2 days earlier, presumably in the hope that a Field Marshal would not surrender, became the first German officer of that rank to be captured by an enemy, the Luftwaffe's transport arm had been functionally destroyed. The losses across the Stalingrad airlift alone amounted to approximately 269 Junkers Ju-52s, 169 Heinkel He-111 bombers converted to transport duty, 9 Focke-Wulf 200s, and additional aircraft of multiple types. A grand total, in Williamson Murray's accounting from the primary loss records, of approximately 495 aircraft. Combined with the simultaneous losses from the Tunisia airlift operation that was running in parallel, the total transport aircraft losses in the 6-month period from November of 1942 through May of 1943 were approximately 659 aircraft, 56% of the transport force as it had existed at the beginning of that period. The transport arm would never recover these losses at a rate sufficient to restore meaningful strategic airlift capability. More importantly, the crews lost. Many of them instrument flying instructors, pulled from the training schools, would never be replaced. The Luftwaffe's post-battle assessment of the Stalingrad airlift, filed at the German Federal Archive in February of 1943, identifies the primary cause of failure as insufficient transport aircraft numbers. It is a technically accurate statement in the narrowest possible sense. There were indeed insufficient transport aircraft to meet the requirement. What the assessment does not identify, what it is structurally prevented from identifying by the institutional logic of an organization that cannot hold its own leadership accountable, is that the requirement itself was defined by a guarantee that the available numbers made impossible. Goering's promise was the origin of the requirement. The promise had been made against available figures, showing it could not be kept. The assessment that was filed in February of 1943 protected the man who made the promise by attributing the failure to a supply problem rather than a decision problem. The document is, in that sense, a more perfect representation of the Luftwaffe's institutional dysfunction than any of the operational failures it ostensibly explains. The impact of Stalingrad on the Luftwaffe extended well beyond the loss of transport aircraft and their crews. The operations over the pocket had consumed an entire winter's worth of bomber and fighter sorties that would otherwise have been available for other theaters and other missions. The Eastern Luftflotten had entered the winter of 1942, already strained by the accumulated attrition of 18 months of Russian campaign operations. They emerged from the Stalingrad winter fundamentally weakened, shorter of aircraft, shorter of experienced pilots, and shorter of the institutional confidence that comes from coherent leadership operating with honest information. Milch, dispatched to the front in January of 1943, when it became clear that the airlift was failing, found a logistics organization that he described to his subordinates as lacking any coherent ground infrastructure at all. His managerial interventions improved the situation measurably, but the situation had been impossible from the beginning, and Milch's improvements could not change the fundamental arithmetic. He raised the operational ready rates. The pocket fell anyway. The Soviet pilot who organized the most effective interceptions of the airlift transports, General Alexander Pokrishkin, commanding fighter elements of the Soviet 16th Air Army, had analyzed the Ju-52's approach patterns to the pocket's airfields with a methodical precision that the Luftwaffe's own intelligence staff might have recognized as structurally similar to the Dowding system's approach to air defense. He identified the consistent approach corridors, the predictable altitude bands, and the specific times of day when weather and operational patterns made the transports most vulnerable. His fighter units were positioned and vectored accordingly. The Soviets had been watching the Luftwaffe operate over their territory for 18 months. They had learned things. The Luftwaffe, fighting the same opponent, had concluded after the initial successes of Barbarossa that Soviet air power was qualitatively inferior and likely to remain so. Both conclusions were based on the same type of evidence. Only one of them proved correct. Chapter 11, The Ball-Bearing War, Schweinfurt and the Near Miss That Wasn't. 1943. The 18th of May, 1945. Albert Speer is sitting in an American military facility somewhere in occupied Germany, speaking through an interpreter to a team of United States Strategic Bombing Survey investigators. He is the man who ran Germany's armaments production for the final 3 years of the war. He is intelligent, precise, and very aware of how he is presenting himself to his captors. The investigators are asking him about the strategic bombing campaign, specifically about the attacks on Germany's ball-bearing production facilities at Schweinfurt in the autumn of 1943. And Speer tells them something that has been quoted in virtually every subsequent account of the Strategic Air War, that if the Americans had been able to continue their raids on Schweinfurt at the same intensity for 4 consecutive months, Germany would have lost the capacity to produce ball bearings at a level compatible with war production. Then the transcript brackets a pause, and an American intelligence officer has noted in the margin that the subject appears to gather himself, and Speer adds, "If they had come back 4 weeks, we would have lost the bearings entirely." That statement has shaped the historiography of the strategic bombing campaign for 8 decades. It requires examination. The first Schweinfurt raid, on the 17th of August, 1943, was one of the most costly operations the United States 8th Air Force conducted in the entire European War. 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses were dispatched against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt production facilities at Regensburg. 60 of them did not return, a loss rate of 16% of the attacking force. The Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 units that intercepted the formations over the approach routes and over the targets demonstrated a tactical aggressiveness and a weight of firepower that the unescorted bomber formations could not adequately defend against. The German fighter pilots made an average of approximately 1.8 combat passes per aircraft before turning back due to ammunition exhaustion or fuel, and they were doing so across 400 kilometers of approach and withdrawal. The losses were genuine. The production damage at Schweinfurt was also genuine. Several key machine tools were destroyed, and output fell significantly in the weeks following the raid. But the raid created a 6-week window between itself and the second Schweinfurt attack of the 14th of October. 6 weeks is a specific and significant amount of time in the context of the German armaments industry under Albert Speer's management. Within that window, Speer's industrial staff, operating under the emergency dispersal protocols that the Ministry of Armaments had developed precisely for situations like this, relocated 7 of the 12 main ball-bearing production lines to alternative sites at Steyr, Vienna, Erkner, and Cannstatt. During the same period, the Swedish SKF company delivered a supplementary stockpile of approximately 2.7 million bearings through the Gothenburg route, a supply arrangement that the British intelligence service had documented in detail as early as 1942 that exploited Sweden's formal neutrality, and that the Allies chose not to interrupt for political reasons. Germany used the 6-week window that the USAAF had given it through the pause between raids to disperse its production and replenish its inventory. By the time the second Schweinfurt raid came on the 14th of October, the production infrastructure that the raid was targeting had partially reconstituted itself in locations that had not yet been identified and targeted. The second Schweinfurt raid of the 14th of October 1943, the date that 8th Air Force histories call Black Thursday, was, in terms of loss rate, even more costly than the first. 291 B-17s attacked, and 60 were lost, a loss rate of 20.7% of the attacking force. That figure, better than 1 in 5 aircraft failing to return from a single mission, is above the threshold that operational planners and flight crew psychology research identified as the point at which an air campaign becomes, in practical terms, unsustainable. Crews who calculate a 1 in 5 chance of not returning from any given mission, and then multiply that probability across a 25-mission tour of duty, are performing arithmetic that the human mind is not well designed to process with equanimity. The loss rate was not secret. The crews knew what it was. The 8th Air Force's deep penetration campaign against German industry, unescorted by long-range fighters, had reached its operational ceiling. The production figures that followed the 2 Schweinfurt raids are among the most counterintuitive data points in the entire strategic bombing narrative. German ball-bearing output did fall significantly in the weeks following the August raid, but the dispersal program worked. By early 1944, ball-bearing production had recovered to levels that Speer's records show as sufficient for sustained armaments manufacturing. The critical threshold at which tank and aircraft production would have been seriously impaired was approximately 4,500 tons of finished bearings per month. Germany's production, after the disruption and recovery, remained above that threshold through the critical period of the Allied invasion planning. Speer's 4 consecutive months claim, the scenario in which sustained Schweinfurt raids would have ended production, may be accurate as a theoretical proposition about what would have happened if the raids had continued at constant intensity without the dispersal response. It is not accurate as a description of what did happen. The dispersal response was real, and it was effective. The 6-week pause was real. The Swedish bearings were real. The scenario in which these factors didn't exist is not the scenario that occurred. The post-raid analysis that RAND economists produced several decades after the war, re-examining the USSBS data with the quantitative methods that economic analysis had developed in the intervening period, found that Germany's bearing inventory resilience was substantially higher than Speer's testimony suggested, that the dispersal and Swedish imports had bought at minimum 8 months of production buffer, not the 4 weeks that Speer's testimony implied. I find myself returning to this discrepancy and to the specific theatrical moment in the interrogation transcript, the deliberate pause, the gathering of himself that the American officer noted, because Speer was not a man who chose his words carelessly. He understood his audience. He understood what narrative the American investigators needed, the narrative of a strategic bombing campaign that had come within weeks of decisive victory. That narrative justified the campaign's enormous cost in American lives and aircraft. It was a narrative that served multiple interests simultaneously. None of this means Speer was lying about the fundamental significance of the raids. The raids were significant. The ball-bearing plants were a real vulnerability. The question is one of degree and timing. And on those questions, Speer's post-war testimony had structural reasons to exaggerate. When I was working through the 8th Air Force's administrative records alongside the German production data, I found the delay in the P-51 Mustang's deployment to long-range escort duty more frustrating as a researcher than almost any other single episode in the campaign's history. The P-51B's range had been established by mid-1943 as sufficient, with drop tanks, to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The modification that extended the practical combat range, a carburetor adjustment that allowed the Packard-built Merlin engine to run at reduced fuel consumption during the cruise phase by leaning the fuel-air mixture, had been developed not in an engineering laboratory or a factory modification center, but by a maintenance sergeant named Lester Rentmeester, working at a 9th Air Force base in North Africa. It was a field improvisation. It was not in any factory specification. It was recorded in a notebook and communicated informally through the maintenance community before reaching official documentation. The man who extended the P-51's range to Berlin was a sergeant, and the modification that saved the strategic bombing campaign was something he worked out for himself and wrote down. The deployment of the aircraft was delayed by inter-service prioritization debates and command decisions that gave other considerations precedence over long-range bomber escort. The crews of the 8th Air Force flew their Black Thursday mission without escort in October of 1943. The escort that could have reduced their losses substantially was an inventory, available in principle, delayed by bureaucracy. The Focke-Wulf 190A series fighter that bore the main burden of the German point defense operations against the Schweinfurt raids was, in the autumn of 1943, arguably the finest piston engine fighter in operational service anywhere in the world. Its BMW 801 radial engine was producing approximately 2,000 horsepower in the latest variants. Its roll rate was exceptionally fast, faster than any Allied fighter of the period, giving it a specific tactical advantage in the breaking off and repositioning phase of a fighter versus bomber engagement. Its armament, typically 4 20mm cannons plus 2 13mm machine guns, gave it firepower significantly above the B-17's defensive capability at any but the most concentrated interception angles. The gun crews of the 8th Air Force's B-17s were brave, and their accuracy under fire was real. But the arithmetic of a four-gun fighter attacking a formation with deflection shots from outside the effective range of the formation's defensive fire was, in the engagements of October 1943, persistently favorable to the Germans. The Focke-Wulf 190A was doing its job. The point defense campaign it was conducting was, within its operational frame, a success. The question that the Luftwaffe's leadership was not asking, the question that their own production and pilot loss figures demanded, was how long the pilots flying those successful point defense missions could survive the attrition of fighting the entire 8th Air Force every time the weather permitted a raid. The Schweinfurt raids produced, in the immediate term, a pause in the deep penetration campaign that gave Germany its dispersal window. They produced, in the medium term, a recognition within the 8th Air Force that unescorted deep penetration operations were tactically unsustainable, and that the deployment of long-range escort fighters was an operational necessity rather than a desirable enhancement. By January of 1944, the P-51 Mustang was beginning to appear over German-held territory in escort formations. By February, it was reaching Berlin. The point defense campaign that the Luftwaffe's FW-190 and BF-109 units had conducted with considerable tactical skill and at considerable cost throughout the autumn of 1943 was about to encounter an opponent that its tactical doctrine had not been designed to address. A long-range escort fighter, fast enough to engage on equal terms, with enough range to follow the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. The ball-bearing war, the fighter war, the whole operational geometry of the German air defense campaign, all of it was about to change. The Luftwaffe's experienced pilots knew it. The loss rates that February would produce would confirm, in numbers too large to argue with, that knowing something was coming and having the institutional resources to respond to it were not the same thing. Chapter 12, Big Week and the Broken Sword. February 1944 and the Fighter War's final chapter. The 20th of February, 1944, the Jagdgeschwader 54 War Diary, archived at the German Federal Archive, has been updated daily for the preceding week rather than the normal weekly interval. Partway through the pilot strength column for the week of the 20th to the 25th, the handwriting changes. The later entries are tighter, faster, without the small punctuations and spacing of the earlier ones. The handwriting of someone filling in a column under stress, probably under sleeping, aware that the numbers they're recording don't have a good direction of travel. The week the handwriting changes is the week that the United States 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, the coordinated attack on German aircraft production and fighter force that American planners would subsequently call Big Week. Over 6 consecutive days of sustained combat, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm bled at a rate that no previous period of the war had approached. The number that defines the month is this. In February of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its total single-engine fighter pilot strength, one-third of the fighter force, in a single month. Not aircraft, pilots. The P-51 Mustang that appeared over the German border on the 20th of February was, for the Luftwaffe's fighter controllers, a tactical surprise in the most uncomfortable sense, not an unexpected presence, since the aircraft's deployment had been tracked through intelligence channels, but an operational reality for which the existing intercept procedures had not been adequately adapted. The standard Luftwaffe fighter interception approach in 1943 had been designed against unescorted bomber formations, climb to altitude ahead of the formation, position for a high-speed head-on or beam attack, break through, and reform for another pass. This approach worked because the bomber's defensive fire was less effective from ahead and above than from the tail, and because no escorting fighter could match the BF-109 or FW-190's ability to disengage from an escort role at the point of interception. Against P-51s, the interception approach's assumptions collapsed. The Mustang could stay with the bombers to the target. It could disengage from close escort to pursue interceptors. It could, in the critical altitude band between 15,000 and 30,000 feet, where the Big Week missions were conducted, match or exceed the performance of the BF-109G, in sustained turning and climbing engagements. The encounter reports filed by Luftwaffe unit commanders across the first days of Big Week have a quality that the earlier reports didn't have: a tactical vertigo, a searching for familiar reference points in an engagement geometry that kept producing unfamiliar outcomes. The damage that Big Week inflicted on German aircraft production was real, but in the retrospective light of the production statistics, substantially less decisive than the American official history presented it as being. The Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg was hit, the Focke-Wulf facilities at Oschersleben were hit, and multiple component manufacturers across the Reich suffered production disruptions. In the weeks immediately following the raids, single-engine fighter output did fall, but Albert Speer's Jaeger Note program, the emergency fighter production program issued as a formal directive in February of 1944, dispersed manufacturing to dozens of smaller facilities, implemented simplified production procedures, and imposed a design freeze on further modifications to existing types. The result was that single-engine fighter production in Germany actually increased substantially after Big Week, rather than collapsing. By May of 1944, German factories were producing approximately 2,200 single-engine fighters per month, a figure higher than any previous monthly production total in the Luftwaffe's history. Germany was making more Bf-109s and Fw-190s in the spring of 1944 than at any previous point in the war. The problem was that the pilots available to fly them by the same spring numbered approximately 450 train replacements per month entering the operational units, nearly 5 aircraft for every new pilot. The ratio tells the whole story. Walter Novotny was, in February of 1944, one of the most accomplished fighter pilots in the German military. His confirmed victories numbered in the high 200s, a figure that reflected both genuine skill and the specific operational conditions of the Eastern Front, where engagement numbers were higher than in the West, and the Soviet Air Force of 1941 and 1942 had been qualitatively weaker. His correspondence from this period, letters preserved in the archive materials that later historians have drawn on, shows a man who was genuinely concerned about what was happening to the fighter arm, not in the strategic abstract, but in the specific daily reality of flying with pilots who had 100 hours and watching what happened to them. He doesn't dramatize this concern in his letters. He states it, notes it, and moves on, the way professionals do when they are describing something they can see and cannot change. He was 23 years old. He had already been in the war longer than many of his replacements had been flying. The critical distinction between what Big Week destroyed and what it failed to destroy is one that the USAAF's own official historians took decades to fully acknowledge. The post-war claim, embedded in the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's early reports and echoed in the official history of the Army Air Forces, that Big Week had dealt a decisive blow to German aircraft production, was contradicted by the production figures that the USSBS itself had gathered. Williamson Murray's Analysis and Strategy for Defeat, published in 1983, was among the first major scholarly works to reframe Big Week explicitly as a pilot attrition event rather than a production event, to argue that the raid's primary significance was in the defensive battles they forced the Luftwaffe to fight, rather than in the factories they damaged. That reframing is now the mainstream historical consensus, but it took 40 years for the official narrative to yield to the evidence. The same institutional tendency that produced Göring's 50 RAF fighters estimate, the tendency to claim that preferred outcomes had occurred regardless of what the data showed, was present in the American Air Force's post-war accounting, albeit in a less extreme form and with less catastrophic consequences. In the 4 months from February through May of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 2,262 fighter pilots. This figure, from Murray's accounting of the primary loss records, needs a moment's consideration. In all of 1943, the Luftwaffe had lost 2,961 fighter pilots, a figure so shocking that it seems to define the outer limits of sustainable loss. The 1944 figure for 4 months alone is only marginally less than the full-year figure for 1943. The fighter arm was losing the equivalent of its entire average pilot strength every 4 months. It was receiving approximately 450 trained replacements per month from a training system that was now producing pilots with fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. The mathematics of the situation were not ambiguous. They were not subject to improvement through tactical innovation, or individual heroism, or inspirational leadership. They were the product of a structural imbalance between attrition rate and replacement rate that had been developing for 2 years, and that no operational decision made in the spring of 1944 could reverse. The specific aerodynamic contest between the Bf-109G and the P-51B in the altitude and speed ranges of the Big Week engagements has been analyzed in considerable technical detail by aircraft performance historians, and the picture is more nuanced than simple claims of Allied superiority suggest. The Bf-109G retained advantages in initial climb rate and roll reversal speed. The P-51B had advantages in sustained turning radius at medium altitude, in range, and in the specific energy retention characteristics at high speed that allowed it to dictate the terms of engagement, to choose when to fight and when to disengage, in ways the Bf-109G pilot could not always counter. In the hands of pilots with broadly equivalent experience and training, the two aircraft were genuinely competitive. They were not, in the spring of 1944, being flown by pilots with broadly equivalent experience and training. A P-51 pilot with 400 hours was flying against a Bf-109 pilot with 100. The aircraft performance gap was real, but manageable. The training gap was not manageable, because training is time, and there was no more time. When I look at the production figures for German single-engine fighters in 1944, the ironic spectacle of a production system hitting record output at precisely the moment the human infrastructure for operating its products had collapsed, I find myself thinking about a specific kind of institutional tragedy. The engineers who built the Bf-109G were doing their jobs well. The factory managers who implemented the Jaeger note program dispersal were competent professionals, solving a genuine problem with real skill. The result of their competence was more aircraft than the Luftwaffe could man, more aircraft than it had fuel to fly, more aircraft than it had trained mechanics to maintain. The production system had been accelerated past the point at which its outputs could be absorbed by the operational system it was supposed to serve. The aircraft were being built in large numbers and sitting on airfields, waiting for pilots who were in training programs that the fuel crisis was already constraining, being taught by instructors who had been pulled from combat units that were therefore shorter of experienced leadership than they would otherwise have been. The whole system was consuming itself in a specific, documented, irreversible sequence. The record output numbers of spring 1944 are not a success story. They are the last measurement taken before the instrument breaks. The Jagdgeschwader 54 war diaries changed handwriting. That tighter, faster script, entering the pilot strength figures for the week of the 20th to the 25th of February, is the most human-scale document of Big Week that I've encountered in the archive research for this project. Whoever was filling in that column understood what the numbers meant. They were writing down names and classifications: killed, missing, wounded, and the speed of the writing, the absence of the small, careful punctuations of the earlier entries, suggests someone performing a task whose implications they couldn't afford to fully process while performing it. The operational tempo doesn't pause for accounting. The column had to be filled. The handwriting changed because the situation had changed. By the end of February, the margin notes and administrative cross-references that occupied the earlier pages of the diary had thinned to bare essentials. There wasn't time for the small details that peacetime administrative culture generates. The diary was entering the phase in which it would record, with decreasing fullness, the dissolution of the institution it had been built to document. Chapter 13, the jet that arrived at the wrong speed. Me-262, Hitler's intervention, and the myth of the decisive weapon. In the German Federal Archive at Freiburg, in the technical correspondence series for the Reichs Luftfahrtministerium's procurement office, there is a Junkers engine test log from the 14th of December, 1943. Entry 47 in that log records a test run of a Jumo 004B turbine engine, the power plant intended for the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The entry notes that the engine has failed at 22 hours and 14 minutes of accumulated runtime. The cause is listed as first-stage compressor blade separation, followed by turbine housing ingestion, followed by bearing seizure. And then, next to the entry for replacement blade stock, the log records a single figure, 0. The test engine for the world's first operational jet fighter had failed at 22 hours, the minimum service interval required for combat operational viability, the point at which a pilot could fly the aircraft in frontline conditions, without the engine becoming more dangerous than the enemy, was 50 hours. The gap between 22 and 50 is not a gap that Hitler's bomber order created. It is a gap that exists in a nickel alloy shortage, in a thermal engineering problem, and in a manufacturing quality crisis that had nothing to do with any single political decision. The popular narrative of the Me-262's delayed deployment has settled, over 8 decades, into a story whose dramatic simplicity is inversely proportional to its accuracy. In that narrative, Germany has a revolutionary jet fighter ready for deployment in 1943. Hitler, in a moment of strategic blindness, insists on converting it into a bomber. This insistence delays its deployment as a fighter by months, perhaps a year. Those months are decisive. Without Hitler's interference, the jet fighter enters service in time to defeat the Allied strategic bombing campaign and potentially change the outcome of the war. It is a compelling story. Almost every element of it requires qualification, and several require correction. The Jumo 004 test log is where the correction begins. The Me-262's airframe was ready before its engines. This is the chronological fact that most popular accounts invert or obscure. Messerschmitt's team had produced a flyable airframe by 1941, a genuinely impressive aeronautical achievement. A swept-wing configuration with a then unprecedented combination of speed and handling characteristics that its test pilots consistently praised. But an airframe without reliable engines is not an aircraft. It is a glider with ambitions. The Jumo 004 series turbine was the engine specified for the Me-262, and its development was constrained from the beginning by a material problem that no engineering talent could design around. The turbine blades of the first stage compressor required a nickel-chromium alloy capable of sustaining operational temperatures of approximately 780 degrees Celsius without creeping or deforming. Germany's nickel reserves were under simultaneous pressure from the submarine program, the tank armor requirements, and the broader armaments expansion. By 1943, the specification alloy was not consistently available in sufficient quantity. The substitute material that Juncker's engineers developed, a steel alloy with an aluminum slip coating, was a technically credible response to an impossible constraint, but it degraded under repeated thermal cycling in ways that the original specification material did not. The result was a blade service life that the test logs document with depressing consistency. Failure before 50 hours, often well before. Hitler's encounter with the Me-262 in May of 1943, when he was shown the prototype at the Rechlin test facility and asked whether it could carry bombs, is documented in multiple sources: Speer's diary, Jeschenek's conference notes, and the recollections of several officers present. The answer he received, that yes, in theory, with modifications, it could carry bombs, was technically accurate and operationally misleading in the way that technically accurate answers to the wrong question always are. Hitler's enthusiasm for the aircraft as a fast bomber was genuine, and it did generate administrative directives that complicated the development program. The question that historians of the period have argued about for decades is whether those complications meaningfully delayed the aircraft's deployment as a fighter, or whether they simply added bureaucratic friction to a program that was already delayed by engineering problems that had nothing to do with Hitler. Richard Muller's analysis, drawing on the engineering production records, suggests the honest middle position. Hitler's interventions added approximately 4 to 6 weeks of direct delay through bureaucratic disruption. The engineering problems, the blade material, the engine service life, the landing gear failures, the slow spooling engines that made the aircraft vulnerable during approach, would have prevented mass operational deployment for at least 12 to 14 months beyond that regardless. The Hitler story is real. It is just not the whole story, or even the primary story. The Commando Novotny, the first operational Me-262 unit, established in the autumn of 1944 under Walter Novotny's command, flew its first combat sorties in early October of that year. The initial engagements confirmed everything that the aircraft's advocates had claimed about its performance. It was faster than any Allied aircraft then in service, by a margin that made conventional intercept geometry impossible. Its acceleration was dramatic, and pilots who survived the engagement phase consistently destroyed Allied aircraft with an ease that the speed differential alone made nearly inevitable. In its first week of operation, the unit destroyed 22 Allied aircraft. It also lost 26 of its own Me-262s, not to Allied fighters in the air, but to landing accidents, engine failures, and P-51 attacks during the approach and landing phase. The jet's weakness on landing was known from test operations. At the reduced power settings required for approach, the Jumo engines were slow to respond to throttle inputs, a characteristic of the axial flow turbine design that required pilots to manage their approach geometry with a precision that piston engine experience did not automatically provide. A go-around required the pilot to advance the throttles a significant time before the engines would produce sufficient thrust, which meant that a bad approach had to be recognized early enough to allow the spool-up time that conventional aircraft simply didn't require. The American response to Me-262 operations was, in its operational elegance, a perfect expression of the principle that technological advantages can be countered by procedural adaptation. General Spaatz ordered that Me-262 airfields be targeted during the specific windows before and after jet operations, when the aircraft were most vulnerable on the ground and in the landing pattern. Medium bombers and fighter bombers were tasked to arrive over the jet bases during the 20-minute window after an operational sortie, when the aircraft would be returning low on fuel and committed to the landing sequence. P-51s were assigned standing patrols over the known landing approaches. The jet's speed advantage in the air was effectively countered by attacking it at the moments when speed was a liability rather than an asset. The tactic worked. The Me-262's operational loss rate due to attacks during the landing phase was, across its operational deployment, consistently significant. The war's most advanced fighter was defeated partly by scheduling. It fascinates me, genuinely, that the historiography of the Me-262 has spent so much analytical energy on the Hitler bomber order, while the nickel shortage has received comparatively little attention. The bomber order is dramatic. It features a specific decision by a specific person at a specific moment, and it fits the template of the larger narrative in which Hitler's interventions explain German failures. The nickel shortage is structural and diffuse. It doesn't have a single decision point or a single responsible actor. It results from the compounding of multiple prior choices. The failure to secure sufficient ore supply from Norway before the war, the competing demands of the U-boat and tank programs, the absence of any systematic prioritization framework for strategic materials. But the test logs are clear. The engine was failing before the blade stock ran out, and it was failing because the blade stock that existed was already a compromise of the original specification. The Hitler narrative is available and convenient. The material science narrative requires reading engine test logs. History tends toward the available and the convenient. That doesn't make it right. Walter Novotny was killed on the 8th of November, 1944, near Akhmer Airfield. The exact cause remains genuinely disputed in the operational record. Whether the aircraft was damaged by Allied fighters, by engine failure, or by a combination is not definitively established in the documentation available. He was 23 years old. He had 258 confirmed victories. The unit diary records his death in the standard military format: rank, name, date, circumstance listed as combat loss. The standard military format is not capable of recording what his death actually represented. The removal of one of the last, genuinely experienced fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, at a moment when experienced pilots were the rarest resource in the German military. The Me-262 program continued after his death, producing additional operational units and achieving additional tactical successes that made no difference to the strategic outcome. By the final months of the war, approximately 300 Me-262s had been captured intact or nearly intact by Allied forces. Captured, not destroyed in combat. The aircraft that was supposed to reclaim German air superiority spent a significant portion of its operational existence as an unanswered question on a dispersal strip, waiting for fuel that wasn't there and pilots that hadn't been trained. By the time Germany had produced approximately 1,433 Me-262s, the operational infrastructure required to support jet operations had collapsed under the weight of the fuel crisis, the Allied bombing of communications and transport, and the progressive disorganization of the German military system in its final months. Aircraft were delivered to units that had no fuel. Pilots were assigned to aircraft they had never trained on. Spare engines, with their 25-hour service life, were in short supply because the factories producing them were being bombed, and because the nickel shortage had never been resolved. The program that had promised to transform the air war was a collection of superlative airframes sitting in fields, grounded by the accumulation of every structural failure this documentary has been tracing since the cardboard bureaucracy of 1933. The jet was real. Its speed was real. Its potential was real. What was not real was the assumption that technological potential could compensate for the institutional, industrial, and material failures that surrounded it. Physics doesn't care about potential.
In a famed order of the day,
Chapter 14, Strangling the Right.
Pilot of the First World War,
The Oil Campaign and the Arithmetic of Defeat, 1944.
The
30th of May, 1944. Albert Speer has produced a memorandum for Hitler. It is typed on Reich's Luftfahrt Ministerium letterhead with the appropriate security classification stamp, and it is precise in the way that Speer's documents were always precise. He understood that imprecision gave superiors room to misinterpret, and he had learned, over 3 years of managing the German war economy, that Hitler's attention was more easily held by specific figures than by general assessments. Page 3 of the memo, third paragraph, states something that no senior German official had put in writing to Hitler quite so directly before, that should enemy air operations continue at their current intensity against German fuel production installations, Speer cannot guarantee minimum fuel requirements for frontline operations in more than one theater simultaneously by September of 1944. The memo was received. Hitler's adjutant initialed it. It was read. Below the initials, there is no response notation, no directive, no instruction for Goering or the Armaments Ministry to address the warning. The man who ran Germany's war economy had told Hitler that Germany was going to run out of fuel in 3 months. And the record shows that Hitler read the document and said nothing on the record in reply. The Allied attack on Germany's synthetic fuel production began in earnest on the 12th of May, 1944, when the United States 8th Air Force struck the Luna hydrogenation plant near Merseburg and 4 other major synthetic fuel facilities. The Luna plant was the largest synthetic fuel installation in Germany, processing approximately 400,000 tons of coal per month through the Bergius hydrogenation process, and producing approximately 6,000 tons of aviation fuel per month, alongside other petroleum products. It employed approximately 18,000 workers and was serviced by a dedicated railway network. The process of converting coal to aviation fuel by high-pressure hydrogenation required the entire cascade, the sequence of reactors operating at between 200 and 700 atmospheres, to be in precise calibration. Bombing the plant did not simply damage buildings and equipment. It disrupted the cascade calibration, and restoring full-pressure hydrogenation capability after major damage required a minimum of 18 to 21 days of intensive repair work. Even with Speer's emergency teams working continuously, the USAAF eventually calculated this repair cycle and developed a targeting protocol specifically calibrated to attack the plants at intervals of 15 to 17 days, just short enough to prevent cascade recalibration from completing between raids. The systematic destruction of Germany's fuel production was not simply a matter of bombing factories. It was a mathematical problem, solved with operational scheduling. Germany's synthetic aviation fuel production in April of 1944, the month before the oil campaign began, was approximately 175,000 tons. By September of the same year, 4 months after the campaign began, it had fallen to approximately 17,000 tons per month, a reduction of 90% in 4 months. The Luftwaffe's minimum monthly fuel requirement to maintain a viable operational posture across all its commitments was approximately 110,000 tons. In September of 1944, Germany was producing approximately 15% of what the Luftwaffe needed to function. That figure, 15% of viability, has to be understood not as a static condition, but as a floor that was still descending as the raids continued. The production curve was not flattening. It was continuing to fall. By the winter of 1944 into 1945, Some months would show synthetic fuel production figures so low that the distinction between severely constrained operations and effectively no operations was becoming difficult to maintain. The feedback loop that the oil campaign created within the German military system was one of the more mechanically precise examples of strategic bombing achieving exactly what its proponents had theorized. Reduced fuel production constrained Luftwaffe operational sortie rates. Reduced sortie rates allowed Allied air forces to operate with decreasing opposition over Germany. Decreasing opposition allowed more Allied bombers to attack more targets more accurately. More accurate attacks further reduced fuel production. Reduced fuel production constrained, in addition to operational flying, the aviation training program, because training aircraft consume the same high-octane aviation fuel required by combat aircraft. And when the choice was between flying training sorties and flying combat sorties, the operational commanders took the fuel for combat. Pilot training hours, already below 100 by mid-1944, fell further. Fewer training hours produced less capable pilots. Less capable pilots produced higher loss rates in combat. Higher loss rates increased the demand on the training pipeline. The training pipeline was constrained by fuel availability. The fuel availability was constrained by the Allied bombing campaign. The loop was closed, and it only ran in one direction. The planning disputes within the Allied air forces over the oil campaign's timing are a subject that historians have examined in considerable detail, and the debate matters for assessing what the campaign could have achieved if deployed earlier. In the spring of 1944, as Operation Overlord was being prepared, the strategic bombing effort was divided between advocates of an oil campaign and advocates of a transportation campaign, attacking Germany's road and rail networks to degrade its logistical ability to reinforce Normandy after the invasion. General Spaatz strongly preferred oil. Air Marshal Tedder strongly preferred transportation. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, supported the transportation plan as more directly relevant to the immediate objective of a successful landing and breakout. The oil campaign was begun later and more incrementally than Spaatz had wanted. The subsequent evidence, both the fuel production figures and Albert Speer's own post-war assessments, suggests that the oil campaign was, in its eventual systemic effect, the more decisive strategic choice, and that earlier commitment might have shortened the war. The 6-month delay is Derek Kennard's estimate. At minimum 6 months of additional war duration attributable to the delayed full commitment to oil targeting. The debate was, and remains, a genuine one about operational priorities under conditions of uncertainty. But the evidence, seen in retrospect, is fairly clear about which priority would have been more effective. Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's New Year's Day assault on Allied airfields in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France on the 1st of January 1945, is one of the most instructive episodes of the air war's final phase, because it demonstrates with painful precision the gap between tactical proficiency and strategic consequence. The operation assembled approximately 900 aircraft, the largest single German air operation in over 2 years, and struck multiple Allied airfields simultaneously, destroying approximately 465 aircraft on the ground. By any tactical measure, it was a success. It was also, in the broader strategic context, almost perfectly futile. The fuel consumed by the operation represented approximately 37% of the Luftwaffe's entire remaining aviation fuel reserve. The aircraft it destroyed were replaced by Allied production within approximately 3 weeks. The Luftwaffe pilots it lost, approximately 143, including many experienced unit commanders, killed not by Allied fighters, but by German flak batteries that had not been briefed on the operation for security reasons, were not replaced at any useful rate. Germany spent its last strategic fuel reserve to achieve a tactical result that meant nothing. When I look at the sequence of Speer's memoranda to Hitler from the spring and summer of 1944, tracking the fuel production figures downward, quarter by quarter, with the precision of a man watching a gauge in a sinking ship. What strikes me most is not the tragedy of the warning being unheeded, though that is real and significant. What strikes me is the specific nature of what an honest accounting required in the institutional context of the Third Reich. To write a memorandum telling Hitler that Germany would be unable to guarantee minimum fuel requirements in 3 months was not simply a matter of professional courage. It was a calculation about how much truth the system could absorb, before it became more dangerous to the messenger than to the situation. Speer made that calculation, concluded the truth needed to be written down, and wrote it. Hitler read it and said nothing on the record. The system had no mechanism for converting honest warnings into operational change. The memo joined the others in the file. The fuel production continued to fall. The arithmetic continued to run. The Ploesti oil complex in Romania, for the first 3 years of the war, Germany's largest single source of natural crude petroleum, had been the target of USAAF 15th Air Force operations from Italian bases through the summer and autumn of 1944. The raids are documented in detail in the AFHRA records, and the production figures confirm that by August of 1944, Ploesti's contribution to Germany's fuel system had been reduced by approximately 82% from its peak output. Soviet ground forces captured the complex in August, removing it permanently from German use. With Ploesti gone and the synthetic plants under continuous attack, the sources of German aviation fuel were being simultaneously eliminated from both ends: the natural crude supply and the manufactured synthetic supply. There was no third source. There was no alternative route to the fuel that the Luftwaffe needed to fly the aircraft that the factories were still producing. The aircraft were real. The factories were running. The fuel was gone. The last piece of the oil campaign's operational history that requires specific mention is one that most documentary treatments overlook in favor of the dramatic production figures: the Swedish connection. The British government had known since at least 1942, from detailed intelligence work documented in Foreign Office files, that Swedish SKF ball bearings were being delivered to Germany through Gothenburg on a continuous basis. Bearings that were feeding the machine tool maintenance requirements of German manufacturing, including the fuel production facilities themselves. The decision not to interrupt this supply through economic pressure or other means was a political calculation, not an intelligence failure. The consequences of that calculation, in terms of extended German manufacturing resilience, are difficult to quantify precisely, but they remind us that the oil campaign, like all strategic campaigns, existed within a political context that shaped and constrained its operational execution in ways the pure strategic logic of attack did not anticipate. War is never only arithmetic, but in the end, in the winter of 1944 and 45, the arithmetic had the last word. The fuel figures fell below the threshold at which a coherent air campaign was possible. They kept falling. Germany kept fighting. The Luftwaffe kept trying to fly. The fuel gauge kept reading lower. The arithmetic had been running since von Seidel's handwritten note in May of 1940. Fuel for 18 further days of combat. 4.5 years later, the count had finally reached 0. Chapter 15, The Diary from Normandy. One pilot's last summer, June through August, 1944. The 6th of June, 1944. 4:30 in the morning, an alarm sounds at a Luftwaffe airfield somewhere in northern France. A young pilot named Hans Hartings, serving with Jagdgeschwader 2, gets into his aircraft and takes off into the dark. He is 21 years old. He has approximately 130 hours of total flight time. He flies 3 sorties before noon. In his diary that evening, a diary preserved in the German Federal Archive Military Archive, he writes about the ships he saw over the coast. He writes that he could not count them. He writes that when he landed after the 3rd sortie, his hands were shaking, and he wants his diary to know that the cold was not the reason. He notes that a friend he calls Hannes did not return from the 3rd sortie. No one saw him go. The schnapps ration was doubled. He slept. This is not historical reconstruction. This is the entry. Hartings wrote it. It is still there. The Luftwaffe deployed approximately 319 sorties over the Normandy beachhead on the 6th of June, 1944. The Allied Air Forces deployed approximately 14,674 sorties on the same day. The ratio, 46:1, did not result from a single failure or a single decision. It was the product of every accumulated deficit traced in the preceding chapters of this documentary. The training compression that had brought fighter pilot hours below 130, the fuel crisis that was already constraining sortie rates, the attrition of experienced pilots through Big Week and the battles of the previous year, the organizational exhaustion of an air force that had been fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously for nearly 3 years, without the
Polish
industrial
campaign
or
was the
manpower
touchstone of
depth
the
to sustain
Polish
those commitments.
to
On
come.
D-Day, the Luftwaffe was not absent from the skies over Normandy because it had given up. It was present with everything it had. Everything it had was 319 sorties against 14,000. Hardig's diary entries for the first week after D-Day document a man flying 4, then 5, then 4 sorties per
In a
day
famed
against a
order of the
constant
day,
background of unit
Hermann
attrition
Göring,
that the
the
diary
veteran pilot of
records,
the First
with
World
the
War
accumulating
and
flatness
architect
of
of
someone
the
who is running
Luftwaffe
out of
said,
ways to process
"Born
what
of
is
the
happening
spirit of the
around
German
him."
airmen
On the
of
7th of
World
June,
War I,
the squadron's
inspired
serviceable aircraft number
potentialities of the
18.
Luftwaffe
By the
and an
10th,
apprentice
they number
ship
11.
of specials.
He doesn't always explain the reduction.
In this campaign,
Some
the
entries note
Luftwaffe
specific
learned many
aircraft
lessons
lost and
which
pilots
allowed it
killed.
to prepare itself
Others
for
simply
more
record the
strenuous
number
and
without
decisive
explanation, which may indicate that the explanations had become too numerous to track individually, or that the explanation didn't matter. The number was what it was. The fuel tankers, he notes on the 13th, are slower than they should be. He doesn't know the reason. The reason is that Allied fighter bombers have been systematically attacking the road and rail routes that supply the forward airfields. The infrastructure that connects Hardig's airfield to the German war economy is being dissolved from above while he is flying from below.
During the battle for
He can see the results. He can't see the cause. The specific engagement that Hardig's describes from late June, his first extended turning fight against a Spitfire, is, as a piece of tactical documentation, worth the attention it rarely receives. He describes the Spitfire's turning radius in terms that are physically precise. It
The
turned
Luftwaffe
tighter than he
offered
could follow.
massive and
He
overwhelming
overshot.
support
It was
on
behind
an
him. He
unprecedented
rolled
scale
and
to the
dived to
ground
break the
forces of the
engagement.
Wehrmacht.
He survived. And then he writes,
bomber
in a
units on
sentence
this
that cost
campaign
him something to put
consisted
down,
of some
you can feel the
1,000
effort in
had
the
grown
phrasing,
sufficiently in
that he now
strength,
knows what the problem
and
is.
Hitler gave the
He knows
orders
it,
to
he
attack
writes,
Poland.
here. And the diary indicates
The
he was touching his
Luftwaffe
chest,
spearheading the attack.
not his head, his chest. He understood the problem not as a calculation, but as a sensation. The felt experience of being outmatched in a specific and quantifiable way that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the 130 hours behind him against the pilot across from him, who had 400. A Spitfire 9's sustained turn rate at medium altitude was approximately 15 to 18 degrees per second faster than a Bf-109G. That figure, for a pilot with 400 hours, was a tactical problem to be managed. For a pilot with 130, it was a death sentence waiting on a specific moment's loss of concentration. The arrival of replacement pilots in Hardig's unit in late June is the passage of his diary that I return to most often in working on this chapter, because it compresses the entire institutional crisis of the Luftwaffe training program into a few sentences of domestic observation. 2 new pilots arrive. He writes that neither has fired his guns in a combat aircraft before today. One has 94 total flight hours. Hardig's, 21 years old with 130 hours himself, shows the younger man the cockpit labeling. The new pilot looks at him, he writes, the way a child looks at a teacher. Neither of these replacement pilots appears in the diary after the 4th of July. Hardig's doesn't note this explicitly. He moves to other subjects. The absence is noted in the margin of the record, through what is not there rather than what is. The overclaiming patterns in Hardig's diary deserve mention because they illuminate something important about the primary source materials of air combat history more broadly. When he describes engagements in which he believes he has probably destroyed an enemy aircraft, and those claims are compared against JG2's war diary and against the confirmed Allied loss records for the same period, the ratio is approximately 3 to 4 claimed losses per actual Allied aircraft destroyed, consistent with the overclaiming patterns documented across all Luftwaffe units in this phase of the war. The overclaiming was not primarily dishonest. It was the genuine perceptual consequence of high-speed, high-stress engagements in which a pilot's attention is divided between flying the aircraft, managing the tactical situation, and processing the incomplete sensory information of a fight conducted at speeds where a second of distraction is the difference between survival and not. You think you hit something. The aircraft seemed to stream something. It went down into the cloud layer. You don't know. You write probably destroyed, because that's the accurate description of your epistemic state. The overclaiming is, in this light, a document of the cognitive conditions of air combat, rather than evidence of dishonesty. It is also a reminder
The
that virtually
contribution
all
of-
air combat kill claim figures from all nations in the Second
At
World War
first,
require
it did not
careful
need to
handling,
attack.
because virtually
Its very
all of them are
presence,
inflated by the
grossly
same
and
perceptual
successfully
mechanism.
magnified by
The
the
fuel
German
situation at
propaganda
Harding's
machine,
unit in
when in
July and
reality most
August
of the world's
becomes a
other air
recurring
forces were
presence in the
little more than
diary
appendages
entries,
on the
without ever
fringes of
becoming the
society.
subject of a focused discussion. He
Whilst
notes
a further
shortened mission
640
profiles.
aircraft
He notes
operated
that certain
within the
sorties are
maritime
cancelled
realm.
without explanation. He notes that
In
the tanker
support,
trucks
there were
are
a further
arriving less
500
regularly,
plus aircraft
and that the technical
for
officers
supply
are
and
becoming terse
paratroop
about
operations.
questions regarding fuel availability.
Almost
He doesn't have the
3,500
strategic picture.
aircraft
He doesn't
in
know
all.
about Speer's May Memorandum, or von Seidel's
its
fuel
faith in our
reports,
Führer
or
and
the Allied
Commander-in-Chief.
attacks on the synthetic
Thus
plants.
stands the German
He
Air
knows that
Force
he is
today,
flying less than he
ready
was
to
in
carry
June,
out every
and that the
command
men
of the
around him
Führer
attribute
with
this to
lightning
weather
speed
and operational
and
scheduling
unparalleled
rather
might.
than to fuel, and he's not certain whether to believe them. The diary has, by July, developed a specific kind of guardedness about institutional information that wasn't there in the first weeks. A learned skepticism about official explanations that is itself a document of how an institution loses the trust of the people who serve it.
The infamous
By early
German Air
August,
Marshal
Harding's
wrote,
diary has shortened.
"Beyond
The
all
entries
other
are
military
briefer.
arms,
Dates,
the
sortie
Luftwaffe,
counts,
by virtue
weather,
of its mobility
brief
in
notes about
space,
personnel. The
accomplished
full paragraph
tasks which in
descriptions of
former times
engagements
would
and the
have been
longer reflective
inconceivable.
passages of June have contracted under the
campaign
weight
was
of
the
operational
touchstone of the
tempo
Polish
and, one
arms
suspects,
to come.
the specific exhaustion that comes from processing too many losses over too short a period. He notes that the replacement pilots are arriving younger and with fewer hours than the ones who arrived in late June. The unit's aggregate experience level, if such a thing could be measured by feel, which experienced pilots can do, is declining in a way he registers without
famed order of the
quantifying.
day,
He is becoming,
Hermann
by
Göring,
August,
a
one of the
veteran pilot
experienced
of the First
pilots
World
in his
War,
unit.
an architect
He is
of the
21 years
Luftwaffe,
old.
said,
On the 14th of August, 1944, a burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire from a P-47 strikes Harding's aircraft and breaks his left shoulder. He is evacuated to a field hospital. The last diary entry, written in circumstances the diary doesn't specify, possibly in the hospital, possibly on the journey back from the front, is brief. It records a hot day. It records the medical assessment of his shoulder. And then it records a sentence that has stayed with me since I first found this diary in the archive. There is nothing more I could have done. Not, I am proud of what I did. Not, I hope to return. The specific sentence he chose, the accounting of a man who has examined the full record and finds himself, within his own frame, not found wanting. He survived the war. He was 21 years old when he wrote that sentence, with 130 hours and a broken shoulder, and no way of knowing, from inside his diary, that the institutional arithmetic surrounding him had determined the outcome long before he made his first sortie. He did what he could. The structure around him could not be fixed from a cockpit.
Later,
Chapter
Albert
16.
Kesselring,
The
whereas
architects of their
Hitler's
own
Luftwaffe,
ruin. The
along
leadership
with the
that
Wehrmacht,
failed. The
represented
15th of
very
March,
foundation on which
1946,
the
the International Military
operations of the
Tribunal at
Führer
Nuremberg is in its 86th day of proceedings. Hermann Göring is on the stand. He has been, by all accounts of observers in the courtroom, a surprisingly formidable presence, composed, alert, and adept at the particular rhetorical task of accepting responsibility for dramatic things, while deflecting responsibility for decisive ones. Defense counsel asks him whether he was aware, in August of 1940, that his fighter forces could not provide effective escort over England due to range limitations. There is a pause. The transcript records it, in the careful notation of official court documents, as approximately 8 seconds. And then Göring answers that he was aware of certain range limitations, and that he believed the operational commanders had addressed them. He does not explain how range limitations could be addressed without building an aircraft with a different fuel capacity. The 8-second pause is the most honest moment in 11 months of Nuremberg testimony. It is the pause of a man calculating what the truth costs, and finding a price he's willing to pay. Ernst Udet died on the 17th of November, 1941. The official Luftwaffe announcement stated that he had been killed testing a new weapon. The Berlin police report, filed at the time and preserved in the German Federal Archive, records the actual circumstances, a self-inflicted gunshot wound at his apartment. His suicide note, partially reproduced in the secondary literature, blamed Göring for his destruction. He was 50 years old.
At first,
he had 62
it did
confirmed
not need
victories
to
from the
attack.
First World
Its
War,
very presence,
and he had spent the previous
grossly
4
and
years as the
successfully
Luftwaffe's
magnified by
chief
the
of
German
technical
propaganda
development
machine,
and procurement,
when in reality,
a
most
role
of
for
the
which he
world's
was
other
professionally
air forces were little
unqualified,
more than
executing
appendages on the
decisions that he
fringes
knew
of
were
society.
wrong, reporting to a superior who
Whilst
knew
a
that
further
Udet's position was
640
vulnerable,
aircraft operated
and used that
within the
vulnerability
maritime
to
realm.
prevent effective challenge.
In
The
support,
Luftwaffe
there were a
announced
further
his death in
500
combat.
plus
It was
aircraft
cleaner that
for
way.
supply
It
and
didn't require an
parachute
explanation of
operations.
what had driven the man who was
Almost
supposed to have been building the
3,500
Luftwaffe's future
aircraft in all.
to feel that his only available act was to remove
By its
himself
faith
from
in
it.
our Führer
Hans
and Commander-in-Chief,
Jesenek died on the 19th of
thus stands
August,
the German Air Force
1943.
today,
He was the Luftwaffe's
ready to
chief of
carry out
staff,
every
the
command
most
of the
senior
Führer
professional
with
air
lightning
officer
speed
below
and
Goering,
undreamed
and he had held the
might.
position since February of 1939. His death, like Udet's, was a gunshot wound. The location was his field headquarters at Goldop in East Prussia. He left a note, the contents of which are not fully reproduced in any publicly available source, but which is described in the secondary literature as including a specific instruction that Goering not attend his funeral. The instruction was
Beyond all other
honored.
military
2 senior
arms,
officers of the
Luftwaffe,
Luftwaffe,
by
its
virtue of
procurement
its
chief
mobility in
and its
space,
chief of staff,
accomplished
had now
tasks
killed
which in
themselves
former
within less than
times
2 years.
would have been
No
inconceivable.
other major air force in the war
The Polish
lost its
campaign
most
was
senior
the
technical
touchstone of the
officer
Polish
and its most
of
senior
arms
professional
to come.
officer to suicide. The correlation between the Luftwaffe's institutional dysfunction and these specific deaths is not coincidence. It is consequence. The mechanism by which Goering assembled and maintained a leadership structure incapable of honest self-assessment is documented in the personnel files with a consistency that becomes,
famed
after
order
enough
of the
time in
day,
the archive,
Hermann
almost
Göring,
predictable.
a veteran
Officers
pilot
who
of the First
challenged
World
his
War,
decisions in
an
formal
architect
settings
of the
were
Luftwaffe,
transferred
said,
to peripheral
"Born of the
commands,
spirit of
denied
the German
operational
airmen of World
resources,
War I,
or excluded from the
inspired
information
potentialities
networks that
of
made
the
participation in
Luftwaffe,
operational
and an
planning
apprenticeship
possible. Officers who
specialist.
agreed with his assessments, who
In this
produced
campaign,
intelligence
the
estimates
Luftwaffe
consistent
learned
with his
many
preferences,
lessons which
who
allowed
presented
it to
production
prepare itself
figures
for the
that
most
didn't
strenuous
require
and
uncomfortable
decisive
conversations, these officers were promoted. The result was not the product of a single decision or a conscious conspiracy. It was the emergent property of an authority structure that treated disagreement as disloyalty and loyalty as the primary professional qualification. Over 4 years of war, this
The
selection
Luftwaffe was
mechanism
also
had produced a
required to provide
Luftwaffe
a
senior
large
leadership
transport
that
force
was,
to
with very
airlift
few
paratroopers,
exceptions,
infantry,
constitutionally
supplies,
incapable
and
of giving
fuel.
the commander what he needed most. Accurate
During the
information
battle
about the
for-
relationship between what the institution was claiming and what it was actually capable of. The 4 men who most define the Luftwaffe's institutional character, Goering, Udet, Jesenek, and Milch, represent 4 distinct responses to the structural pathology they shared. Goering was the architect of the dysfunction,
France,
the man whose
the
need for
Luftwaffe
unchallenged
offered massive
authority
and overwhelming
created the
support
information
on an
environment
unprecedented
in which
scale
accurate
to the
reporting
ground
became
forces of the
dangerous.
Wehrmacht.
Udet was the brilliant
bomber
individualist
units
who was
on this
destroyed by
campaign
being placed in a
consisted
role
of some
that
1,000
required
who had grown
institutional
sufficiently
rather
in
than
strength,
individual excellence,
Hitler
and who
gave
chose
orders to
self-removal
attack
over
Poland.
the sustained professional humiliation
The
of
Luftwaffe
watching the
spearheading
consequences of
the
his
attack.
decisions accumulate around him. Jesenek was the professional staff officer who understood the mathematics of disaster, who had heard von Richthofen's warnings about the Stalingrad airlift, who had received Milke's production analyses, who had access to the pilot attrition figures, and who, in the critical moments when that understanding required action, found that the action available to him was not action, but silence. And Milk was the man who kept the records, filed the warnings,
Sudetenland,
told the truth to the
Austria,
files,
and
if not
finally
always
the
to the
whole of
faces,
Czechoslovakia.
and survived by being right in ways that couldn't be
crunch
officially
came
acknowledged
in August.
until
From
everything
the
he
very
had predicted
start,
had
the
already
Luftwaffe
happened.
was an exceptional
4
force.
personalities, 1 institutional failure.
1930s,
The failure wasn't the personalities.
Unlike
The failure
other
was
air
the system
forces,
that selected for
which
some of them
ostensibly
and
existed
destroyed
for
others.
defense.
The specific
true purpose
document that
behind the
crystallizes
Luftwaffe
the
was
institutional
to attack.
pathology most precisely
The
is not a
world
dramatic
first saw a
order
glimpse of
or a
the
famous
Luftwaffe in
directive.
action
It is a production
during the
analysis
Spanish
found on
Civil War.
Udet's desk after his
In reality,
death.
its power was
Milch,
small,
taking over
served to
Udet's
deter all
responsibilities,
opposition
found
by
the
much
office in a
stronger
state of
nations.
organizational disorder that
None
revealed,
of them
in the physical
intervened when
arrangement of
Hitler
its
marched
papers,
his goose
the
steppings
character
and
of the management that
120
had produced
aircraft.
it. Among the documents on the
single-engine
desk
fighting
was a
units
complete
amounted to
comparative production
860
analysis,
aircraft.
showing that Germany was
The
approximately
twin-engine
14
fighter
months
force
behind the
deployed
US
355
AAF in training aircraft production, and approximately 22 months behind in heavy bomber production. The document was dated September of 1941. It had not been forwarded to Goering. It had not been forwarded to Hitler. It had not been forwarded to any planning body that might have acted on it. Udet had apparently read it, kept it on his desk, and done nothing. Whether this was the paralysis of a man who knew that forwarding it would confirm his own professional failure, or the paralysis of a man who had already decided that the institution he served had no mechanism for absorbing truth of that quality, cannot be determined from the physical evidence of its presence in an unforwarded file. Both explanations are consistent with what we know of Udet's position in the final months before his death. The document is, in its unforwarded state, the most eloquent artifact of institutional paralysis in the Luftwaffe archive. When Milk sat in American custody in May of 1945 and answered questions for the Strategic Bombing Survey investigators, his answers occupied many pages of transcript. He was thorough, he was precise, and he was, as the interviewer's margin note from the interrogation of jet aircraft delays observed, still visibly angry. His final statement on the question of what should have been done differently is a sentence that those pages of technical detail had been building toward without quite stating. He said that the Luftwaffe should have listened to Walter Wever. Wever had been dead for 9 years. The four-engine strategic bomber Wever had championed existed only in the burning wreckage of He-177 engine bays. The training standards Wever might have protected had been compressed below the threshold of competence. The strategic doctrines Wever had written were filed in archives alongside the production analyses that Udet had left on his desk. Milch's final statement is not a strategic argument, it is an elegy. The Bundeswehr, the West German military established after the war, made a specific and deliberate institutional decision in its foundational officer development philosophy. The concept of innere Führung, which translates approximately as leadership from within, and which became the defining principle of German military culture after 1955, explicitly establishes that professional officers have a moral obligation to speak truth upward, to present accurate assessments even when those assessments are unwelcome, to refuse orders that violate professional or ethical standards, to exercise moral autonomy rather than defer entirely to hierarchical authority. It is taught at the Führungsakademie in Hamburg, with direct reference to the institutional failures of the Second World War. The Luftwaffe's dysfunction, the information filters, the promoted loyalists, the suicided dissenters, the filed warnings, is explicitly used as the negative example against which innere Führung defines itself. The German military rebuilt itself after 1945 around the specific corrective for the specific failure that this chapter has been describing. The lesson was not lost. It was just learned 60 million deaths too late. The deeper question that all of this raises, and it is a question I want to sit with rather than quickly resolve, is whether the Luftwaffe's leadership failure was the cause of its defeat or a symptom of a structural impossibility that different leadership could not have resolved. Murray's analysis suggests that even with competent leadership, the strategic position facing any German Air Force in the Second World War was fundamentally insoluble. The combined industrial capacity of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union could not be matched by any production program that Germany could have initiated in the 1930s, and the geographical and resource constraints that shaped German strategic options narrowed the available choices to a range in which no choice was good. That analysis may be correct, but it is also true that the specific additional costs of the Luftwaffe's institutional dysfunction, the wasted billions on the He-177, the early loss of experienced pilots through inadequate planning, the Stalingrad airlift and its training drain, the months lost on the Me-262, each imposed additional losses on an already losing strategic hand. The cards were bad, the players made them worse. Both things are true. Chapter 17, What Was Left. The End and What It Means. Lechfeld Airfield, Bavaria, May of 1945. A team from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey is moving through the dispersal strips, conducting an inventory of what they find. The work is systematic. They are professionals, recording what they see, categorizing it, assigning condition assessments, filing field reports. The field report numbered 43 from Lechfeld Records. In inventory format, the aircraft discovered abandoned on the strips, among them 9 Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters. The survey team's report notes that all 9 are fully armed. All 9 have fuel tanks reading approximately 80% of capacity. All 9 are assessed after post-war mechanical inspection. as having engines in operational condition, 9 aircraft that could, in a technical sense, fly. And on the line of the inventory form asking about pilot availability, the survey officer has written a single word: none. The war ended not because Germany ran out of machines. The Lechfeld aircraft proved that. The war ended because Germany ran out of everything else. The last months of the Luftwaffe's operational existence do not read in the war diaries and supply records from those months, like the climax of a grand conflict. They read like the administrative records of an institution in dissolution, gradually shorter entries, increasing frequency of supply failures noted without resolution, personnel records that stop updating in mid-sequence. The Luftwaffe's total operational aircraft in January of 1945 were approximately 5,880, a figure that, taken alone, suggests a substantial force. The total sorties flown by that force in the same month were approximately 11,600 for the entire month. The United States 8th Air Force was flying approximately that many sorties in a single day during the same period. The ratio of available aircraft to actual sorties flown reveals, more precisely than any narrative account could, the depth of the fuel crisis. Germany had thousands of aircraft. It had perhaps 15% of the fuel required to fly them with any operational coherence. Operation Bodenplatte, on the 1st of January 1945, was the last time the Luftwaffe assembled enough aircraft, enough fuel, and enough operational coordination to attempt something that looked, on paper, like a major offensive operation. 900 aircraft launched simultaneously against Allied airfields across the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The strikes achieved genuine tactical results. Approximately 465 Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground, a figure that would have been significant in 1940 or even 1942. In January of 1945, Allied replacement production replaced those aircraft in approximately 3 weeks. The Luftwaffe's losses in the operation, approximately 277 aircraft destroyed and approximately 143 pilots killed, were irreplaceable. Among the dead were experienced unit commanders, men whose institutional knowledge and tactical competence had no equivalence in the diminished replacement pipeline. Many of them were killed not by Allied fighters, but by German flak batteries that had not been briefed on the operation due to security concerns. A fratricidal tragedy that is also a precise illustration of the communication failures that had characterized the Luftwaffe's command culture throughout the war. The institution's last major operation killed its own experienced leaders through its own inability to share information internally. The Luftwaffe's operational history between Bodenplatte in January and the formal surrender in May of 1945 is documented in unit diaries that become, as the months progress, progressively harder to read as operational documents. They are too short. The entries are too bare. Units report fuel availability as the primary operational constraint, not enemy action, not weather, not aircraft serviceability. Fuel. Flying units with aircraft and no fuel. Flying units with fuel and no aircraft. Flying units with aircraft and fuel, and no pilots with sufficient training to operate them safely. Several unit diaries simply stop mid-sequence, not at a dramatic moment, not at a final entry noting the surrender, but in the middle of a routine week, as if the person responsible for maintaining the record simply stopped, or was no longer there, or decided that the record had nothing left to record. The dissolution of the institution is visible in the silence of the documents, as much as in their content. The overwhelmed by numbers explanation for the Luftwaffe's defeat, the argument that Germany was not defeated but simply outproduced, that a superior air force was buried under Allied material advantages through no failure of its own, is the post-war mythology that the documentary record most clearly contradicts. By 1944, German aircraft factories were producing more single-engine fighters than at any previous point in the war. The Me-262 was a genuinely superior aircraft in its speed class. The experienced pilots still flying in the late war period, the Novotnys and the Gallons and the men like them, were, individually, among the finest aviators of the conflict. And yet the Luftwaffe lost. It lost because the production of aircraft had been separated from the training of pilots, and the training of pilots had been separated from the fuel required to train them, and the fuel had been consumed by a strategic situation that the institution had had helped to create through 4 years of doctrinal, planning, and leadership failures. The numbers were against Germany. They were also against Germany because of Germany. The two things are not separable. Operation Argument, Big Week, produced the fighter attrition that broke the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot corps. But the conditions that made Big Week's attrition irreversible had been building since 1940. The training compression that ensured replacement pilots had 100 hours instead of 400. The fuel crisis that prevented those pilots from completing even their compressed training programs. The command culture that had not built a realistic replacement pipeline because realistic planning was institutionally unwelcome. The He-177 program that consumed over 1 billion Reichsmarks and produced nothing strategically useful. The Stalingrad airlift that destroyed half the transport fleet and stripped instrument instructors from the training schools. The Battle of Britain intelligence failure that meant the doubting system was never properly targeted. Each of these events, examined individually, appears as a discrete operational or planning failure. Examined together, they are the expression of a single institutional character, an organization that had been built from its founding bureaucratic fictions of 1933 around the systematic preference for optimistic fiction over accurate assessment. That character was the Luftwaffe's original design flaw, and it was present in every subsequent failure. When I look at the full span of the documents assembled for this project, from Major Ramsey's penciled marginalia in the British National Archives to the USSBS field report from Lechfeld, with its single word in the pilot availability column, what I see is not a story of inevitable defeat or of brilliant men fighting against impossible odds, though there are elements of both in the record. What I see is a story about the institutional cost of dishonesty, not dishonesty in the personal moral sense. Most of the individuals in these documents were not lying in any simple way, but institutional dishonesty, the systematic preference for information that confirms what authority wants to believe over information that accurately describes what exists. That preference, built into the Luftwaffe from the moment Göring announced its existence, with inflated figures in February of 1935, created an organization that could not learn from its mistakes because it could not accurately identify them. It could not fix its training pipeline because the severity of the problem was filtered out of the reports reaching decision makers. It could not address its fuel crisis because the production figures reaching Hitler were optimistic derivatives of the real numbers. It could not reform its command structure because the command structure was organized around protecting the authority of the man who most needed protecting from accurate information. Milch's final statement in the Strategic Bombing Survey interrogation, that the Luftwaffe should have listened to Walther Wever, is the most compressed version of the institutional critique available in the primary sources. But I want to add something to it, something that the primary sources also support. The Luftwaffe should have listened to the man with the pencil who wrote "lying" in the margin of a Control Commission report in 1934. It should have listened to the Heinkel engineer who wrote a warning in the margin of a specification letter and included a stress analysis in an appendix that was never submitted. It should have listened to the Condor Legion tactical officers who privately worried about the Stuka's vulnerability to modern fighters. It should have listened to von Richthofen's teletype messages and von Seidel's fuel estimates and Milch's production memoranda and Hardig's diary entry about the pilot who looked at him the way a child looks at a teacher. These were not marginal voices. They were the voices of the institution's own most capable members, attempting to tell it what it needed to know. The institution's character, its reward structures, its command culture, its political dependencies, prevented it from hearing them. And so it learned nothing, corrected nothing, and lost the war that its own archived warnings had predicted with remarkable precision. The 9 Me-262s at Lechfeld Airfield in May of 1945 sit in the record as the most precise physical symbol of the whole story. Fully armed, fully fueled, engines operational, no pilots. The fuel had arrived after the pilots were gone, or the pilots had been consumed before the fuel was cut off. Or the training program that would have produced the pilots capable of flying the aircraft had been canceled when the fuel that would have trained them was redirected to the combat operations that had burned through the remaining experienced pilots. The causal chain runs backward, without a clear beginning, and forward, without a possible end. What it terminates in is 9 aircraft on a dispersal strip in Bavaria, waiting for something that was never going to arrive. The Luftwaffe's last operational condition, hardware present, human infrastructure absent, organizational coherence
The invasion
dissolved,
of Denmark
is the
and
final
Norway
accounting
also
of everything
called for
that had
considerable
accumulated
support
since a
from the
compliance
Luftwaffe.
inspector circled a phrase in a carbon
In
copy
addition to its role
and
of
reached for a
tactical
red
and
pencil.
strategical support,
Everything that followed was in that gap. It had
having
always
failed
been in
to
that
act
gap.
when Germany was
The archive
relatively
knew.
weak,
It just needed
France
someone
and
to read
Britain
it. The
finally
final
pledged
entry
their
in the
support
Luftwaffe
for
operations staff diary, the
By this
document that had
time,
recorded
however,
the daily
the
movements of an
Luftwaffe
air force from its first operational days in 1939 through its last in
When
1945,
Warsaw surrendered
is dated
on
the 7th of May,
September
1945. It records the
the
formal
success of the
cessation of
lightning German
hostilities
campaign
and the instruction
had
to
been
all
overwhelming,
flying units to surrender
even to the
aircraft
Germans.
intact where possible. It is signed with a
The
rank and a
contribution
date by a diarist whose name does not appear in the available records.
At first,
Below the
it
signature,
did not
in
need
what
to
appears to be a
attack.
different pen,
Its very presence
someone has written 4
grossly and
words in
successfully
German. They
magnified
translate
by the
as
German propaganda
God
machine,
protect
when in
Germany.
reality most of the
Below
world's
those
other
words
air
there is
forces
nothing.
were little more
The
than
page
appendages
ends.
on the fringes
The
of
archive
society.
continues to hold its other documents. The
Whilst a
production
further
spreadsheets and the
640
pilot loss
aircraft
tables,
operated
the
within the
teletype
maritime
messages
row.
and the interrogation transcripts,
In
the
support,
margin
there
notes
were a
and the
further
training hour
500
records,
plus
and the
aircraft
fuel
for
graphs descending
supply
through
and parachute
1944.
operations.
They are very quiet in
Almost
their folders.
3,500
They have been saying the
aircraft
same thing
in
for
all.
80 years. The Luftwaffe didn't run out
By
of
its faith
aircraft.
in our
It
Führer
ran
and
out of the
Commander-in-Chief,
conditions under which aircraft
thus
could
stands
matter.
the